Welcome back, fellow travelers of the galaxy far, far away. If this tale of darkness and what might have been brings you peace in these twilight hours, please like this video and subscribe to join our journey through the hidden chronicles of the Star Wars universe. In the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten sorrow, there exists a holocron that few have dared to activate. It speaks of a timeline that never was, yet feels more real than the history we know. It tells of a galaxy that burned not under the cold calculation of Emperor Palpatine, but under the blazing fury of a heart that loved too deeply and fell too far. Picture, if you will, the throne room of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant. But this is not the sterile chamber of shadows that Palpatine built. This throne is carved from the bones of 1,000 worlds. Its armrests formed from melted lightsaber crystals that once sang with the voices of fallen Jedi. Upon it sits not an ancient manipulator in dark robes, but a figure whose very presence makes the Force itself recoil in terror. Emperor Anakin Skywalker. His breathing no longer requires the mechanical rhythm of Vader's mask, for he never fell to Obi-Wan's blade on Mustafar. Instead, his lungs draw in the fear of 1 trillion souls. His heart beats with the pulse of dying stars. Where Palpatine ruled through cunning and patience, Anakin commands through the raw, unbridled power of emotions that have consumed galaxies. The Chosen One did not bring balance to the Force. He shattered it. From his throne he watches as entire star systems bow before him, not out of political necessity, but out of pure primal terror. For this emperor does not merely command armies or fleets. He reaches across the void of space with his mind and stops hearts with a thought. He speaks, and solar winds carry his voice to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, where his words become law written in the very fabric of reality. But how did the hero of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Knight who once stood for justice and protection, become a force of destruction that makes Palpatine's empire seem like a child's game? What happened in those crucial moments when destiny itself took a different path? In the ruins of the old Senate building, where democracy once flourished, there stands now a monument of twisted metal and weeping stone. Carved into its base are words that make even the bravest souls whisper in dread. Here fell the last Chancellor of the Republic, struck down not by rebellion or war, but by the very apprentice he thought to control. But that is merely the beginning of this tale of terror. For in a hidden chamber beneath the monument, sealed by powers that bend reality itself, something stirs. The sound of a woman's voice, speaking words of love that have curdled into prophecy. The cry of twin infants who will grow to inherit a galaxy built on the bones of their father's victims. And behind it all, the echo of a lightsaber igniting for the first time, not in defense of the innocent, but in service of absolute dominion. What you are about to hear is the chronicle of that darker path, where the Chosen One's love became the galaxy's curse, and where the very force that once promised balance became the instrument of its own destruction. This is the story of what would have happened if Anakin Skywalker had not fallen to become Darth Vader, but had risen to become something far more terrifying. This is the story of Emperor Anakin Skywalker, and the galaxy that burned beneath the weight of his love. In the final hours of the Clone Wars, when the galaxy teetered on the precipice between Republic and Empire, destiny itself held its breath. The Opera House on Coruscant gleamed with artificial light as Chancellor Palpatine wove his web of words around young Anakin Skywalker, speaking of powers that could cheat death and save those he loved. But in this timeline, the spider's web caught not a fly, but a dragon. As the Chancellor spoke of the glorious empire they would build together, Anakin's enhanced senses detected something that changed everything. The faint electrical signature of a hidden recording device. In that instant, he realized that every word, every confession, every moment of weakness he had shared was being preserved, not for blackmail or control, but for entertainment. Palpatine had been collecting his emotional torment like a connoisseur collecting fine wines. The moment of divergence came not in the Chancellor's office, nor in the Jedi Temple during that terrible night of betrayal. It came 3 hours before Order 66 was to be executed, in the depths of Palpatine's private chambers beneath the Senate building. Anakin had arrived, as planned, to report the death of Mace Windu and pledge his service to his new master. But the young Jedi's mind, sharpened by desperation and the growing whispers of the dark side, had begun to see patterns that even Palpatine had not anticipated. The rage that erupted from Anakin Skywalker in that moment was not the slow burn of the dark side's seduction, but the sudden terrible fury of a predator realizing he had been prey. His lightsaber ignited without conscious thought, and in one fluid motion that seemed to bend reality around it, he struck down the most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years. The Chancellor's chambers filled with an energy so dark and chaotic that the Force itself seemed to stagger. Anakin stood over the body of his would-be master, but he felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice done. Instead, he felt the terrible weight of absolute clarity. Palpatine had been a cancer in the galaxy's body, but cutting out a cancer required skill, precision, and most importantly the will to take on the responsibility of healing what remained. Palpatine's death was not the theatrical spectacle it might have been. There were no lightning bolts, no grand speeches about the nature of power. The ancient Sith simply looked up from his desk, saw the blue blade descending, and in his final moment smiled, for he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He had not created an apprentice, but something far more dangerous, a Sith Lord who believed himself righteous. As the young Jedi who was no longer a Jedi activated Palpatine's private communication array, he began to understand the true scope of the web that had been woven around the galaxy. Clone commanders awaited orders that would never come. Separatist leaders believed they were fighting for freedom while being manipulated toward their own destruction. And in the Jedi Temple, masters sat in meditation, unaware that their greatest enemy had just been replaced by one infinitely more dangerous. Anakin's first command as the galaxy's new ruler was delivered through Palpatine's own communication network, in the Chancellor's voice, perfectly mimicked through a combination of technology and force manipulation. He spoke to the clone commanders scattered across 1,000 battlefields. But the orders he gave were not the ones Palpatine had planned. Order 66 was executed, but with a terrible modification. The Jedi were not to be killed outright, but captured and brought to Coruscant. Those who resisted would be eliminated, but those who surrendered would be given a choice: join the new order or face judgment for their failures. It was a mercy that would prove more cruel than any execution. The Senate building on Coruscant became the first monument to Anakin's new vision. He did not dissolve the Senate as Palpatine would have done, but instead transformed it into something far more sinister, a body that retained all the appearance of democratic governance while serving as nothing more than an echo chamber for his will. Senators who had spent years learning to navigate Palpatine's subtle manipulations found themselves facing something they had no tools to combat: absolute honesty backed by absolute power. Within the space of 6 hours, the Republic died, not with the political maneuvering that Palpatine had planned, but with the surgical precision of a surgeon who had diagnosed a terminal illness. Anakin's forces moved through the galaxy with an efficiency that terrified even the clone troopers who carried out his orders. Star systems that had been locked in devastating conflicts for 3 years suddenly found themselves under new management. Their wars ended not by negotiation or victory, but by decree. When Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan stood to question the legality of the emergency measures being implemented, Anakin did not have him arrested or disappeared. Instead, he invited the good senator to examine the evidence of Palpatine's treachery firsthand. The holocrons recovered from the Chancellor's private chambers contained recordings of every corrupt deal, every manipulation, every lie that had been told to the Senate over the course of the war. But more than that, they contained Palpatine's private thoughts on each senator, including detailed psychological profiles and plans for how each would be eliminated once they were no longer useful. Senator Organa's own assassination was scheduled for 3 days after the war's end, along with Mon Mothma of Chandrila and dozens of others who had shown even the slightest tendency toward independent thought. But in the depths of the Jedi Temple, where the surviving Jedi Masters waited in custody, a different truth was becoming apparent. Yoda, ancient and wise beyond measure, had felt the disturbance in the Force when Palpatine died, but what followed was far worse: the sensation of the dark side not being vanquished but transformed into something new and infinitely more chaotic. The revelation of Palpatine's true nature had the desired effect. The Senate did not resist Anakin's assumption of power because they genuinely believed he had saved them from something worse. In those first crucial days, as the galaxy struggled to understand what had happened, Anakin appeared to many as a savior rather than a conqueror. He had ended the war, exposed corruption, and promised to restore the peace and justice that the Republic had lost. Master Windu, recovered from his injuries and held in the Temple's detention cells, spent his captivity trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had felt Anakin's conflict, had seen the young Jedi's struggle between light and dark, but this was different. This was not a fall to the dark side as the Jedi understood it, but something that defied their ancient categories of light and shadow. The Force itself seemed to be rewriting its own rules around Anakin Skywalker. Where a Sith drew power from passion channeled through hatred, Anakin drew his strength from love transformed into something possessive and terrible. He did not hate the galaxy he now ruled. He loved it so completely that he could not bear to see it make choices he deemed harmful to itself. On the 3rd day of his reign, as reports poured in from across the galaxy of conflicts ended and order restored, Anakin stood in the Chancellor's office that was now his throne room. He had not yet modified the space to reflect his new status. That would come later. For now, he was content to stand at the great window that looked out over Coruscant's endless cityscape and contemplate the magnitude of what he had inherited. The galaxy was his to protect, his to guide, his to love in the way that he had never been able to love anything without the fear of loss. For the first time since his mother's death, Anakin Skywalker felt truly at peace. He had the power to ensure that no one he cared about would ever suffer again, that no world would ever know the chaos and pain that had defined his childhood on Tatooine. And somewhere in the Force, the ancient balance that had existed for millennia shuddered and began to break apart, not under the weight of hatred or ambition, but under the terrible pressure of love that recognized no limits and would accept no loss. In the medical center of the Jedi Temple, Padme Amidala lay in recovery from childbirth, unaware that the galaxy had changed forever while she brought new life into it. The twins that would become Luke and Leia Skywalker drew their first breaths in a universe that was already being reshaped by their father's love. They would grow up not as the hidden hope of a fallen republic, but as the heirs to an empire built on the foundation of absolute devotion. Decades have passed since that fateful day when the galaxy's destiny was rewritten in a single stroke of a lightsaber, in the hidden archives beneath what was once the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, now transformed into the monument of eternal vigilance. A lone figure moves through chambers filled with the echoes of forgotten voices. Kira Valeth, keeper of the hidden histories, has dedicated her life to understanding the truth behind the rise of Emperor Anakin Skywalker, a truth that has been buried beneath layers of propaganda and fear. The quest that has brought her to this forbidden place began with a dying Jedi's whisper, a master who had escaped the initial purges and lived in hiding for 30 years before finally succumbing to the accumulated weight of guilt and sorrow. With his final breath, he had spoken of a holocron hidden in the deepest levels of the old temple, one that contained the true account of how Anakin Skywalker had seized power, not through the patient manipulation that characterized Palpatine's rise, but through a demonstration of raw force that left the galaxy no choice but to submit. Kira's connection to the Force is weak but persistent, a whisper rather than a roar, which has allowed her to survive in a galaxy where stronger Force sensitives have long since been absorbed into the Emperor's service or eliminated entirely. Her fingers trace the surfaces of ancient holocrons, their crystalline structures still humming with the memories of those who created them in the final days of the Republic. These are not the official records that fill the Imperial archives, but the desperate testimonies of those who witnessed the transformation of a hero into something far more terrifying than any villain. As Kira activates the ancient recording device, the chamber fills with the blue-tinged image of a figure she recognizes from historical records. Jocasta Nu, the former chief librarian of the Jedi archives. The elderly woman's face bears the weight of terrible knowledge as she begins to speak, her words carefully chosen to convey the maximum amount of information in the limited time she has before her inevitable capture. Master Nu's voice carries across the decades, speaking of the morning when the galaxy woke to find itself under new management. The Clone Wars, which had raged for 3 years and consumed countless lives, had ended not with the gradual victory of one side over the other, but with the sudden, inexplicable cessation of hostilities across every battlefront simultaneously. Clone troopers and separatist droids had simply stopped fighting, as if some greater authority had declared the conflict over by divine decree. The explanation, when it came, arrived in the form of a holographic broadcast that reached every inhabited system in the galaxy. The figure who appeared was familiar to many. Anakin Skywalker, the hero with no fear, the Jedi Knight whose exploits during the Clone Wars had made him a legend among the common people. But the man who spoke to the galaxy that day was transformed, not by the physical corruption that would have marked a traditional fall to the dark side, but by something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. This was not the crude domination that a Sith Lord might employ, forcing obedience through fear and pain. This was something far more sophisticated, the absolute certainty that Anakin Skywalker's vision for the galaxy was not only correct, but inevitable. Those who felt his touch came away not with the desire to rebel, but with the understanding that rebellion itself was a form of madness, a rejection of obvious truth. Standing in the ruins of Palpatine's private office, surrounded by evidence of the former Chancellor's treachery, Anakin had addressed the galaxy not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction as he explained how he had discovered the truth about the war, how both sides had been manipulated by a single mastermind who had played Republic and Separatists against each other for his own amusement. But it was not the revelation of Palpatine's deception that had shocked the galaxy into submission. It was what Anakin demonstrated next. As cameras focused on his face, the young man who had once been the Jedi Order's greatest hope reached out with his mind and touched the consciousness of every living being watching his broadcast. For just a moment, every sentient creature in the galaxy felt the touch of his thoughts, experienced the depth of his conviction, and understood with perfect clarity that resistance was not merely futile, but pointless. Master Nu's recording describes the chaos that followed, not the chaos of resistance and civil war, but the chaos of a galaxy-wide governmental structure attempting to reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. Systems that had been locked in deadly combat for years suddenly found their leaders in communication with each other, working together to implement the new Emperor's directives. The Separatist Council, rather than being executed as war criminals, were brought to Coruscant and given positions in the new Imperial administration, their unique perspectives valued as part of Anakin's vision of unity through diversity. The speed with which the transformation occurred was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Anakin's rise to power. Within 72 hours of Palpatine's death, every major governmental and military position in the galaxy had been filled with individuals who demonstrated absolute loyalty to the new Emperor. These were not appointments made through coercion or blackmail, but selections based on Anakin's supernatural ability to perceive the true nature of every person he encountered. Clone troopers, bred for loyalty and trained to follow orders without question, found in Anakin not just a commanding officer but a figure worthy of the devotion they had been engineered to feel. The inhibitor chips that Palpatine had used to ensure their compliance with Order 66 became unnecessary. The clones served Anakin with a loyalty that transcended programming and entered the realm of religious devotion. Standing in the main hall of the Jedi Temple, now converted into a court of judgment, Anakin had addressed the assembled masters with words that cut deeper than any lightsaber. He spoke of younglings taken from their families and raised in emotional isolation, of the Order's political entanglements that had led them to serve as generals in a war they should have prevented, of their failure to detect and stop the Sith Lord who had manipulated galactic events from the very heart of the Republic. But perhaps the most disturbing element of Master New's account concerns the fate of the Jedi Order itself. Rather than being destroyed outright, the surviving Jedi were brought before their former comrade and given a choice that revealed the depth of his transformation. Anakin did not offer them the traditional Sith ultimatum of join or die. Instead, he asked them to examine their own failures, to confront the ways in which their adherence to ancient dogma had contributed to the galaxy's suffering. Some Jedi, confronted with the undeniable truth of their Order's failings, chose to abandon their ancient ways and join Anakin's new vision of Force users as guardians and guides rather than detached monks. Others, unable to accept the destruction of everything they had believed in, chose exile to the unknown regions, carrying with them the burden of knowledge that they had failed not just themselves but the galaxy they had sworn to protect. Master Yoda, ancient beyond measure and wise in ways that transcended normal understanding, had looked into Anakin's eyes during that final confrontation and seen something that chilled him to his core. The young man was not lying, not even to himself. Every word he spoke, every justification he offered, every vision of the future he described was believed with absolute sincerity. This was not the corruption of the dark side as the Jedi understood it, but something new, something that their ancient teachings had no framework to comprehend. The recordings preserved in Jocasta News' holocron described the final days of the Jedi Order, not as a violent purge, but as a gradual dissolution. Those who remained on Coruscant found themselves assigned to new roles in the Imperial administration, their Force abilities utilized not for combat, but for the peaceful resolution of conflicts and the detection of corruption. They were still Jedi in name, but Jedi transformed into something that served the Emperor's vision of order and justice. As Kira continues to study the ancient records, she begins to understand the true genius of Anakin's consolidation of power. He had not destroyed the existing structures of galactic civilization, but had instead absorbed them into something larger and more comprehensive. The Senate continued to meet and debate, but their discussions now centered around the most effective implementation of policies that the Emperor had already decided were necessary. The clone army remained in place, but their mission shifted from conquest to protection, ensuring that the peace Anakin had imposed would be maintained against any who might threaten it. But perhaps the most crucial element in understanding Anakin's rise to power lies in the personal relationships he maintained during those early days of his reign. Unlike Palpatine, who had ruled through isolation and manipulation, Anakin surrounded himself with individuals who genuinely cared for him and whom he trusted completely. His wife Padme, though initially horrified by his actions, gradually came to understand the necessity of what he had done and the vision he pursued. The recordings speak of Padme's transformation from democratic idealist to imperial advocate, a change that came not through coercion but through the gradual realization that traditional democratic processes had failed to prevent the horrors of the Clone Wars. As she recovered from childbirth and gradually assumed her role as Empress, she became not just Anakin's partner in power but the public face of the New Order's compassionate side. The birth of Luke and Leia Skywalker, occurring just days after their father's assumption of power, had been seen by many as a sign of hope for the future. These children would grow up in a galaxy free from war, raised by parents who possessed both the power and the wisdom to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. They would be educated not just in the ways of the Force, but in the complexities of governance and the responsibilities that came with absolute authority. The Imperial Palace on Coruscant bears little resemblance to the sterile chambers that Palpatine had preferred during his reign, where the former Chancellor had surrounded himself with the cold grandeur of ancient Sith artifacts and minimalist design. Anakin Skywalker chose to build his seat of power as a monument to connection and belonging. The throne room itself is a marvel of engineering and artistry, its soaring crystal walls incorporating elements from 1,000 different worlds, each one representing a system that had freely chosen to join his vision of galactic unity. Kira's exploration of the palace archives reveals the meticulous care with which Anakin had planned his coronation ceremony, an event that would serve not merely as the formal recognition of his authority, but as a demonstration of the new relationship between ruler and ruled that his empire would embody. Unlike the secret machinations that had marked Palpatine's rise to power, Anakin's assumption of the imperial title was conducted in full view of the galaxy, broadcast simultaneously to every inhabited world, and observed by representatives from every species and culture that called the galaxy home. The crown itself tells a story that encapsulates the fundamental difference between the old empire and the new. Rather than crafting it from precious metals or ancient artifacts, Anakin had commissioned its creation from the lightsaber crystals of fallen Jedi, not as a trophy of conquest but as a memorial to their sacrifice. Each crystal had been carefully selected from the weapons of masters who had died during the Clone Wars, their kyber cores singing with the memories of those who had wielded them in service to the galaxy. But the most remarkable aspect of the crown was its central stone, the crystal from Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber, recovered from the ruins of Naboo and purified through a process that had taken Anakin months to complete. The crystal, once blue with the light of the Jedi way, now pulsed with a color that had never been seen before in any lightsaber, a deep purple shot through with veins of gold, representing the synthesis of light and dark that Anakin claimed to embody. Padme Amidala stood beside the throne as Anakin approached, holding their newborn twins in her arms. The sight of the royal family, young and beautiful and full of hope for the future, moved even those who had come to the ceremony with reservations about the new order. Here was not the cold dynasty of Sith tradition, but a family bound together by love and united in their commitment to protecting the galaxy they now ruled. The ceremony itself took place not in the Senate building or the Jedi Temple, but in the great courtyard of the Imperial Palace, under the open sky where all could witness the moment when the galaxy's new age began. Representatives from every system stood in carefully arranged sections, their placement determined not by political allegiance or military strength, but by the degree of suffering their worlds had endured during the Clone Wars. Those who had lost the most were given places of honor closest to the throne, a gesture that spoke to Anakin's commitment to healing the wounds that the conflict had inflicted. The actual moment of coronation defied every expectation that observers had formed based on their knowledge of imperial history. There was no elaborate ritual, no ancient words of power, no demonstration of dark side abilities that had become synonymous with Sith rule. Instead, Anakin simply took the crown from its place on the ceremonial pedestal and placed it upon his own head, the gesture so natural and unassuming that many in the audience wondered if they had missed some crucial moment. But then the Force itself seemed to take notice of what had occurred. A wave of energy, visible as a shimmering distortion in the air, spread outward from the newly crowned emperor in all directions. Every Force-sensitive being in the galaxy felt it simultaneously, not the cold touch of the dark side, or the warm embrace of the light, but something entirely new, something that spoke of balance achieved not through the elimination of one force or the other, but through their synthesis into something greater than the sum of its parts. The speech that followed would be studied and analyzed for generations to come, not for its political content, but for the way it fundamentally redefined the relationship between those who governed and those who were governed. Anakin spoke not as a conqueror addressing his subjects, but as a protector explaining his responsibilities to those he had sworn to defend. His words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, and those who heard them came away with the unshakable conviction that every policy, every decision, every action taken by the new emperor would be motivated by a genuine desire to improve the lives of all sentient beings. The response was unprecedented in the history of galactic governance. System after system, species after species, culture after culture voluntarily pledged their loyalty to the new emperor, not because they feared the consequences of refusal, but because they genuinely believed that he represented their best hope for a future free from the conflicts and injustices that had plagued the galaxy for generations. The most remarkable moment of the ceremony came when Anakin opened his mind to the assembled representatives, allowing each of them to experience directly the depth of his commitment to their welfare. This was not the crude mental domination that Sith Lords employed, but something far more intimate and far more powerful, the complete transparency of his intentions. In that moment, every delegate understood with perfect clarity that Anakin Skywalker's love for the galaxy was not a political slogan or a rhetorical device, but a living force that would guide every aspect of his reign. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the coronation was what it revealed about the nature of the power that Anakin now wielded. Traditional Sith philosophy taught that power flowed from the subjugation of others, that strength came from the ability to impose one's will upon the unwilling. Anakin's approach was fundamentally different. His power came from the voluntary surrender of others' autonomy, their willing acceptance of his authority because they trusted him completely to use it wisely. The archives contained detailed reports from intelligence operatives who had been tasked with monitoring the reactions of various groups to the coronation ceremony. Separatist holdouts, who had been expected to view the event as the ultimate triumph of their enemies, instead found themselves moved by Anakin's promises of reconciliation and healing. Former Republic loyalists, who might have been expected to resist any form of imperial rule, discovered that their new emperor shared their commitment to justice and equality. The weeks following the coronation saw a transformation of galactic society that defied every prediction that political analysts had made. Rather than the gradual consolidation of power that had characterized Palpatine's reign, Anakin's empire seemed to spring into existence fully formed, its institutions and policies appearing as if they had always existed. Bureaucratic efficiency improved overnight, as officials found themselves genuinely motivated to serve the public good rather than their own interests. Military units that had been bitter enemies during the Clone Wars began working together to rebuild the infrastructure that the conflict had destroyed. Most surprising of all was the reaction of the surviving Jedi. Rather than viewing Anakin's assumption of imperial power as a betrayal of everything they had taught him, many of the masters who had once been his teachers came to see it as the fulfillment of the prophecy they had never fully understood. The Chosen One, they realized, had indeed brought balance to the Force, but not in the way they had expected. He had not destroyed the Sith to preserve the Jedi, nor had he eliminated the Jedi to serve the Sith. Instead, he had transcended both traditions to create something entirely new. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the rapid conversion of military production facilities from weapons manufacturing to civilian infrastructure. Factories that had produced clone troopers and battle droids were retooled to construct medical centers and schools. Shipyards that had built star destroyers began launching hospital ships and exploration vessels. The entire economic foundation of the galaxy shifted from war to peace with a speed that economists declared impossible. But beneath the surface of this remarkable transformation, Kira's research reveals disturbing undercurrents that hint at the true cost of Anakin's vision of galactic unity. The same Force abilities that allowed him to inspire voluntary loyalty could also be used to eliminate dissent before it could even form. Those who might have organized resistance to the new order found their opposition melting away as they came into contact with the Emperor's overwhelming presence. The few recorded instances of attempted rebellion during the early days of Anakin's reign tell a consistent story. Potential dissidents would arrive at their planned meetings with every intention of organizing resistance, only to find themselves questioning the wisdom of their actions. Not through external pressure or threats, but through a gradual realization that their grievances were based on misunderstandings or outdated assumptions about the nature of imperial rule. The crown that Anakin wore was more than a symbol of authority. It was a focus for abilities that transcended anything the galaxy had seen before. Through it, he could monitor the emotional state of entire populations, detecting unrest or dissatisfaction before it could manifest in organized opposition. But rather than suppressing these feelings through force, he addressed their root causes with policies and initiatives that eliminated the sources of discontent. The result was a form of governance that was simultaneously the most benevolent and the most totalitarian in galactic history. Citizens of the Empire enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, security, and freedom, but only so long as their desires aligned with Anakin's vision of what was best for them. Those whose wants conflicted with the greater good found themselves gently but inexorably guided toward more appropriate aspirations. The coronation ceremony concluded with a moment that would become the defining image of Anakin's reign. The new emperor, crown upon his head and twins in his arms, standing before the cheering crowds of Coruscant, as Padme placed her hand on his shoulder. It was a tableau of power tempered by love, of authority grounded in service, of strength guided by compassion. To those who witnessed it, it seemed to promise an age of peace and prosperity, unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. But in the shadows of the great courtyard, among the representatives and dignitaries and common citizens who celebrated the birth of the new empire, a few observant souls noticed something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. In the reflection of the crown's crystals, in the play of light across Anakin's face, there was something that spoke not of divine blessing, but of cosmic imbalance. The Force itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting to see what terrible price would ultimately be demanded for the peace that had been purchased with a single man's unlimited love. In the months following Emperor Anakin's coronation, the galaxy experienced what historians would later call the Golden Season, a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity that seemed to validate every promise the new ruler had made to his subjects. From the core worlds to the outer rim, systems that had been devastated by 3 years of relentless warfare began to rebuild with a speed and efficiency that defied all previous understanding of post-conflict recovery. Kira's investigation into this period reveals a wealth of documentation that paints a picture of almost miraculous transformation. Trade routes that had been closed for years reopened overnight, their safety guaranteed not by massive military patrols, but by the simple understanding that piracy and raiding had become not just illegal but somehow unthinkable. Refugees who had fled their homeworlds during the Clone Wars returned to find not only their cities rebuilt but improved beyond their wildest dreams. The Emperor's first major policy initiative, the Galactic Reconstruction Accords, demonstrated a level of foresight and compassion that even his harshest critics found difficult to question. Rather than simply rebuilding what had been destroyed, Anakin's administration sought to address the underlying inequalities and injustices that had made the Clone Wars possible in the first place. Worlds that had been exploited for their natural resources were given ownership stakes in the companies that extracted them. Species that had been marginalized by human-centric republic policies found themselves elevated to positions of authority and respect. The archives contain thousands of personal testimonies from beings whose lives were transformed during this period. A Twi'lek family on Ryloth, who had lived in poverty for generations while their world's resources were strip-mined by off-world corporations, suddenly found themselves the owners of a thriving manufacturing complex. A group of Wookiee engineers whose expertise had been dismissed by Republic bureaucrats as primitive were put in charge of designing new starship technologies that revolutionized space travel. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these changes was the speed with which they were implemented. Traditional galactic governance moved at the pace of committee meetings and legislative debates, with even simple policy changes taking years to navigate through layers of bureaucracy. Under Anakin's rule, problems were identified and solved with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. It was as if the Emperor possessed not just the authority to make decisions, but the ability to ensure that those decisions were carried out exactly as he intended, without the delays and complications that had plagued previous administrations. This efficiency extended to every aspect of imperial governance. The clone armies which had been created for warfare were retrained and redeployed as construction crews, medical personnel, and teachers. Their genetic programming for loyalty and obedience, which had made them ideal soldiers, proved equally valuable in civilian roles where dedication and reliability were paramount. Worlds that had been battlegrounds became showcases of the Empire's commitment to healing and growth. Kira's research into this period reveals the meticulous care with which Anakin approached each decision. The Emperor did not govern through grand proclamations or sweeping decrees, but through thousands of small, carefully considered actions that addressed specific problems with surgical precision. A food shortage on one world would be resolved before its citizens even realized they were in danger. A trade dispute between neighboring systems would be settled before it could escalate into conflict. Potential sources of unrest were identified and eliminated not through suppression but through the removal of their underlying causes. The transformation was so complete and so beneficial that many beings who had initially opposed Anakin's rise to power found themselves reconsidering their positions. The separatist worlds, which had fought for independence from what they saw as a corrupt and inefficient republic, discovered that the Empire offered them something far better: autonomy within a framework of mutual support and cooperation. Their unique cultures and traditions were not only preserved but celebrated as valuable contributions to the galactic community. The most compelling evidence of the Empire's benevolent nature during this period comes from the personal writings of beings who had every reason to oppose Anakin's rule. Mon Mothma, the former senator from Chandrila, who had been among the Republic's most vocal critics of authoritarian governance, wrote in her private journal of her amazement at the Emperor's commitment to democratic principles. Though the forms of government had changed, she observed, the substance of representation and accountability had been preserved and even strengthened. Bail Organa of Alderaan, who had spent years building networks of resistance to what he saw as the Republic's drift toward tyranny, found himself serving as one of Anakin's most trusted advisors. His expertise in constitutional law and civil liberties was not dismissed or marginalized, but elevated to a position of central importance in the new administration. The policies he helped craft ensured that the Empire's efficiency did not come at the cost of individual freedom or dignity. The economic transformation of the galaxy during this period was perhaps the most visible sign of the Empire's success. The war economy that had consumed vast resources while producing nothing but destruction was replaced by a system focused on creation and growth. Unemployment, which had plagued many worlds as their industries were converted to military production, became a thing of the past as new opportunities emerged in fields that had been neglected during the conflict. Medical research, which had been limited to developing treatments for battlefield injuries, expanded to address the chronic diseases and genetic disorders that afflicted billions of beings across the galaxy. Educational institutions, which had been stripped of resources to fund the war effort, found themselves not only restored but enhanced with technologies and teaching methods that made learning more effective and accessible than ever before. The arts, which had suffered under the austerity measures of wartime governance, experienced a renaissance that surpassed even the golden age of the Old Republic. Artists, musicians, and writers from every world and culture found themselves supported and encouraged to share their unique perspectives with the galactic community. The Emperor himself was known to attend cultural events regularly, not as a distant ruler making obligatory appearances, but as a genuine enthusiast who engaged deeply with the works being presented. But it was in the realm of Force education that Anakin's vision proved most revolutionary. Rather than maintaining the Jedi Order's traditional secrecy and exclusivity, he established academies throughout the galaxy where Force-sensitive beings could learn to develop their abilities in service to their communities. These schools were not training grounds for warriors or mystical monks, but centers of learning where students studied medicine, engineering, agriculture, and countless other fields where Force sensitivity could be used to improve life for all. The curriculum at these academies reflected Anakin's own understanding of the Force as a tool for connection and healing rather than conflict and domination. Students learned to sense the emotional states of others, not to manipulate or control them, but to better understand their needs and concerns. They developed telepathic abilities not for espionage or interrogation, but for facilitating communication between species with incompatible languages or sensory modalities. Perhaps most remarkably, these Force users were trained to work in teams, rather than as solitary heroes. The Jedi tradition of individual mastery and personal enlightenment was replaced by a philosophy of collective responsibility and shared wisdom. Groups of Force sensitives would collaborate on projects that no single individual could accomplish, their abilities harmonizing and amplifying each other in ways that produced results far beyond what their individual talents might suggest. The success of this approach was evident in the rapid resolution of problems that had seemed intractable under previous administrations. Environmental disasters that would have taken decades to repair were remediated in months through the coordinated efforts of teams that combined Force abilities with conventional technology. Diplomatic crises that might have escalated into wars were resolved through the intervention of mediators who could literally feel the emotions and motivations of all parties involved. The pattern was so subtle that it might have escaped notice entirely, if not for the trained eye of a historian who had spent years studying the ways in which authoritarian regimes typically consolidated power. The absence of resistance was not the result of successful propaganda or effective repression, but something far more unsettling, the elimination of the very desire to resist. But even as evidence mounted of the Empire's beneficial effects, Kira's investigation began to uncover subtle inconsistencies that suggested a more complex reality beneath the surface. The personal testimonies that filled the archives, while genuine in their praise for Anakin's administration, shared certain curious similarities in their language and perspective. Beings from vastly different cultures and backgrounds seemed to have arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about the nature of the Emperor's rule and the benefits it provided. More troubling still were the gaps in the historical record. Certain events that should have generated extensive documentation seemed to have left almost no trace. Opposition movements that had been active during the transition period simply disappeared from the archives, not because they had been violently suppressed, but because they seemed to have voluntarily dissolved themselves. Critics of the new order who had been vocal and persistent in their objections suddenly fell silent, not because they had been silenced, but because they appeared to have genuinely changed their minds. Kira's companion in this investigation, an elderly Bothan named Voss, who had served as an intelligence analyst during the Clone Wars, began to express doubts about the narrative they were uncovering. His species' natural paranoia and talent for detecting deception made him uniquely qualified to spot the inconsistencies that might escape others. The Empire's success, he argued, was too complete, too universal, too perfectly aligned with Anakin's stated goals to be entirely natural. The breakthrough in their investigation came when they discovered a cache of personal recordings made by a group of former separatist leaders during the early days of Anakin's reign. These beings had arrived on Coruscant prepared to negotiate the terms of their surrender, expecting either imprisonment or execution for their role in the rebellion against the Republic. Instead, they found themselves welcomed as valued advisors and offered positions of responsibility in the new government. The recordings capture their initial confusion and suspicion, their gradual acceptance of Anakin's sincerity, and finally their enthusiastic embrace of his vision for galactic unity. But what makes these documents truly disturbing is the way they document the subtle erosion of the leaders' original personalities and convictions. Over the course of several weeks, beings who had spent years fighting for separatist independence began to express genuine belief that their rebellion had been misguided and that unity under imperial rule was not only preferable but inevitable. The transformation was not sudden or violent, like the crude mental domination that Sith Lords traditionally employed. Instead, it was gradual and apparently voluntary, as if the leaders were slowly coming to understand truths about themselves and the galaxy that they had previously been unable to see. They retained their memories, their personalities, their fundamental sense of identity, but their values and priorities shifted to align perfectly with those of their new emperor. Deep beneath the gleaming towers of Imperial City, in chambers that do not appear on any official architectural plans, Kira and Voss discover the true foundation upon which Emperor Anakin's benevolent facade has been constructed. The revelation comes not through dramatic confrontation or spectacular discovery, but through the patient assembly of fragments, like archaeologists reconstructing an ancient civilization from scattered pottery shards. The implications of this discovery cast a shadow over everything Kira and Voss had learned about the Golden Season. If Anakin possessed the ability to reshape the thoughts and emotions of others without their knowledge or consent, then the galaxy's apparent acceptance of his rule might not be the genuine expression of popular will that it appeared to be. The peace and prosperity that the Empire had brought might be real, but the price paid for it might be something far more precious than anyone had imagined: the very capacity for independent thought and authentic choice. The first clue emerges from transportation records that seem almost deliberately obscure. Shipping manifests speak of educational materials being transported to facilities on remote worlds, but the quantities involved suggest something far more substantial than textbooks or teaching aids. The destinations are equally puzzling: planets that had been devastated during the Clone Wars and subsequently abandoned, their populations relocated to more habitable worlds as part of the Empire's humanitarian initiatives. Voss's intelligence background proves invaluable in deciphering the coded language that permeates these documents. What the manifests describe as educational facilities, he recognizes as the infrastructure of something far more sinister: a galaxy-wide network of institutions designed not to educate, but to reshape the fundamental nature of those who enter them. The students being transported to these locations are not eager learners seeking knowledge, but force-sensitive beings who have been identified as requiring what the Empire terms perspective adjustment. The euphemistic language that characterizes all documentation related to these facilities reveals the careful thought that has gone into their conception and implementation. There are no references to imprisonment, punishment, or re-education in the traditional sense. Instead, the records speak of guided self-discovery, clarification of purpose, and alignment with galactic harmony. The beings sent to these locations are described not as prisoners or victims, but as candidates for enhanced understanding, who have been selected for the privilege of participating in the Emperor's vision of a perfected galaxy. Kira's examination of the psychological profiles attached to these transport orders reveals a disturbing pattern. The Force-sensitives selected for perspective adjustment share certain characteristics that suggest they have been chosen, not for any crimes they have committed, but for qualities that the Empire views as potentially problematic. They are beings who have demonstrated unusual independence of thought, resistance to authority, or commitment to principles that conflict with Imperial priorities. Among the files, she discovers the profile of a young Jedi Padawan named Lyra Casares, who had survived the initial purges and gone into hiding on her homeworld of Sullust. Her crime, according to the Imperial assessment, was not violence or rebellion, but an unwillingness to accept that the Jedi Order's destruction had been necessary for galactic peace. Her continued belief in the traditional Jedi teachings, despite all evidence of their failure, marked her as a candidate for correction rather than elimination. The facility to which Lyra had been sent was described in the records as the Institute for Philosophical Advancement on Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld that had been transformed into something that defied easy categorization. The planet's dark side nexus, which had once corrupted countless beings who ventured there, had been somehow harnessed and refined by Anakin's engineers into a tool for what the documentation termed accelerated enlightenment. The process employed at these institutes was unlike anything in the historical record of either Jedi or Sith methodology. Rather than breaking down the subject's existing beliefs through torture or manipulation, the facilities sought to expand their understanding until their original convictions became untenable. Force-sensitives would be exposed to carefully controlled doses of dark-side energy, not to corrupt them, but to show them the futility of resistance to forces beyond their comprehension. The records speak of subjects experiencing visions of alternate timelines, where their cherished beliefs led not to justice and peace, but to endless cycles of conflict and suffering. They would witness the consequences of Jedi interference in galactic affairs across centuries, seeing how their order's rigid adherence to ancient dogma had contributed to the very problems they claimed to solve. Most disturbing of all, They would be shown the inevitable failure of any attempt to oppose the Emperor's will, not through threats or demonstrations of power, but through logical analysis that made resistance appear not just futile, but actively harmful to the subjects themselves and everyone they cared about. The genius of the system lay in its apparent voluntarism. At any point during their stay at the institutes, subjects could choose to leave and return to their previous lives. The only requirement was that they demonstrate a genuine understanding of why their previous beliefs had been misguided, and a sincere commitment to embracing the truth that the Empire represented. Those who completed the program did so not as broken prisoners or mindless converts, but as beings who had undergone what they experienced as genuine spiritual awakening. The documentation includes detailed case studies that reveal the sophistication of the techniques employed. Each subject's treatment was individually tailored based on their psychological profile, cultural background, and specific areas of resistance to imperial authority. A Jedi who valued compassion above all else would be shown how their selective empathy had contributed to galactic inequality. A being committed to personal freedom would be guided to understand how their individualism had prevented them from contributing to the greater good. Perhaps most unsettling of all were the success rates reported by these facilities. The overwhelming majority of subjects who underwent perspective adjustment emerged as enthusiastic supporters of the Empire, not because they had been brainwashed or coerced, but because they had come to genuinely believe that their previous convictions had been based on incomplete understanding. They retained their personalities, their memories, and their capacity for independent thought, but their fundamental values had been realigned to harmonize with Anakin's vision of galactic order. The few subjects who proved resistant to the process were not subjected to harsher measures or eliminated as threats to imperial security. Instead, they were simply returned to their communities with their memories of the Institute intact but subtly modified. They would remember their time there as a period of philosophical education that had helped them better understand their place in the galaxy, even if they had chosen not to fully embrace the Empire's teachings. This apparent tolerance for dissent served as powerful propaganda for the regime's benevolent nature. But Kira's investigation reveals that even these apparent failures served the Empire's purposes. The returning dissidents carried with them a profound sense of the Emperor's power and wisdom, even if they had not been converted to his cause. Their descriptions of the institutes as places of learning rather than punishment helped to maintain the Empire's reputation for fairness and reasonableness. More importantly, their continued presence in their communities served as a form of surveillance, as their modified thought patterns made them unconsciously responsive to imperial influence. The network of facilities extended far beyond the obvious candidates for perspective adjustment. Hidden among the Empire's legitimate educational institutions were specialized programs designed to identify and cultivate force-sensitive children before they could develop problematic attachments to alternative philosophies. These young beings were not removed from their families or isolated from their communities, but were provided with educational opportunities that gradually shaped their understanding of the Force and their place in the galactic order. The curriculum at these schools was a masterpiece of subtle indoctrination disguised as enlightened pedagogy. Students learned about the failures of previous Force-using orders, not as historical curiosities, but as cautionary tales about the dangers of extremism and ideological rigidity. The Jedi were presented not as villains, but as well-intentioned beings who had allowed their good intentions to blind them to the complexity of galactic politics. The Sith were similarly portrayed as cautionary examples of what happened when personal ambition was allowed to override concern for the greater good. The Force itself was taught not as a mystical energy field that connected all living things, but as a tool that could be used to serve the collective welfare of galactic civilization. Students learned to sense the emotions and needs of others, not for personal enlightenment, but to better understand how they could contribute to the harmony and prosperity that the Empire sought to achieve. Their abilities were developed not through meditation and self-discipline, but through practical application in service to their communities. The archives contain detailed psychological profiles of students who had graduated from these programs, and the patterns they reveal are both impressive and deeply troubling. These young Force users possessed a level of technical skill that surpassed many Jedi Masters, but their understanding of the Force was fundamentally utilitarian. They saw their abilities not as expressions of their connection to the cosmic order, but as talents that could be employed to solve practical problems and improve material conditions. The result was a generation of Force users who were more powerful and versatile than their predecessors, but who lacked the independence and moral complexity that had characterized both Jedi and Sith. They were capable of extraordinary feats, but their achievements were always directed toward goals that aligned with imperial priorities. They could move objects with their minds, influence the thoughts of others, and perceive events across vast distances, but they could not conceive of using these abilities in ways that might challenge or undermine the Emperor's authority. The implications of this educational program extended far beyond the Force-sensitive population. The techniques developed for shaping the thoughts and values of these special students were gradually being introduced into the general educational system throughout the Empire. Children across the galaxy were learning to think in ways that made imperial authority seem not just legitimate but inevitable. They were developing value systems that prioritized collective harmony over individual expression, practical results over abstract principles, and loyalty to proven leadership over democratic participation. Most significantly, they appeared to lack the capacity for the kind of spiritual doubt and questioning that had driven both Jedi and Sith to seek deeper understanding of the Force's nature. They accepted the Empire's teachings about the Force with the same unquestioning certainty that previous generations had shown toward the dogmas of their respective orders, but without the underlying tension that had motivated those traditions' greatest achievements and most spectacular failures. The process was so gradual and apparently benevolent that even beings who might have objected to overt indoctrination found themselves approving of the changes. Test scores improved, behavioral problems decreased, and graduates of the new educational system proved to be more productive and cooperative citizens than their predecessors. The benefits were real and measurable, making criticism of the underlying methodology seem petty and ideological. But as Kira delves deeper into the documentation, she begins to understand the true scope of what Anakin has accomplished. The purification protocols are not simply a means of eliminating opposition to his rule, but a comprehensive transformation of galactic consciousness itself. He is not content to rule over subjects who merely obey him. He seeks to create a civilization in which obedience to his will is so natural and voluntary that the very concept of resistance becomes meaningless. The most chilling discovery comes in the form of a personal message from the Emperor himself, recorded for the administrators of the Purification Network. In it, Anakin speaks with the same passionate sincerity that had characterized his public addresses, but his words reveal the true depth of his transformation from the idealistic young Jedi who had once sought to free the slaves of Tatooine. He speaks of love as the guiding principle of his reign, but it is a love that recognizes no boundaries and accepts no limitations. He loves the galaxy so completely that he cannot bear to see it make choices that he knows will lead to suffering. He loves its citizens so deeply that he must protect them from their own capacity for error and delusion. He loves the Force itself so intensely that he must guide it away from the chaotic extremes that had characterized its previous manifestations and toward the perfect balance that only he can provide. In the shadows of the archive chamber, as the weight of this revelation settles upon them, Kira and Voss begin to understand the true horror of what they have uncovered. Anakin Skywalker has not become a tyrant in the traditional sense, ruling through fear and oppression. He has become something far more dangerous, a being whose love for the galaxy has transformed into a need to control every aspect of its existence, and whose power is sufficient to make that control seem not just beneficial but inevitable. In the private chambers of the Imperial Palace, behind walls that shimmer with force-dampening crystals and security systems that respond to Anakin's thoughts alone, Kira discovers the most intimate and devastating records of the early Empire. Hidden within a vault that bears Padme Amidala's biometric locks are the personal holocrons of the woman who became Empress, documents that reveal the gradual transformation of a democratic idealist into the willing partner of absolute power. The first recordings date from the days immediately following Anakin's assumption of imperial authority, when Padme was still recovering from the birth of Luke and Leia. Her voice, though weakened by childbirth, carries the same passion for justice and democratic principles that had made her one of the Republic's most respected senators. In these early entries, she speaks of her horror at what Anakin has done, her disbelief that the man she loved could have seized power so ruthlessly, and her determination to convince him to restore the democratic institutions he has dismantled. The holocrons capture the private conversations between husband and wife during those crucial first weeks, revealing the gentle but inexorable process by which Anakin began to reshape Padme's understanding of power, governance, and the responsibilities of leadership. He does not argue with her principles or dismiss her concerns, but instead guides her toward a deeper appreciation of the complexities and contradictions inherent in democratic rule. But more disturbing than the revelation of political corruption is the documentation of democratic complicity in the Republic's moral failures. Padme discovers that the very senators she had worked alongside, beings she had respected as principled public servants, had been aware of the injustices perpetuated by the system they served. They had known about the exploitation of non-human species, the environmental destruction caused by unregulated industrial expansion, and the growing inequality that had made the Clone Wars inevitable. Padme's recordings describe her growing awareness of the Republic's failures, not through Anakin's arguments, but through evidence he provides from Palpatine's private archives. She learns of the systematic corruption that had pervaded every level of government, the corporate influence that had shaped legislation to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor, and the political paralysis that had prevented meaningful action on the galaxy's most pressing problems. The holocrons reveal that these senators had not been prevented from addressing these issues by Palpatine's manipulation or separatist threats, but by the political calculations that democratic governance demanded. Every attempt at reform had been derailed not by external opposition, but by the need to build coalitions, secure funding, and maintain electoral viability. The very mechanisms that were supposed to ensure representation and accountability had instead created a system where meaningful change was virtually impossible. Anakin's genius, Padme begins to understand, lies not in his rejection of democratic values, but in his synthesis of democratic ends with authoritarian means. He seeks to achieve the justice, equality, and prosperity that democratic societies claim to pursue, but without the inefficiencies and compromises that democratic processes seem to require. The result is a form of governance that delivers everything democracy promises but rarely achieves, at the cost of the procedural safeguards that democratic theorists consider essential. The transformation in Padme's thinking is gradual but profound. Her early recordings speak of her determination to serve as a check on Anakin's power, to preserve some space for democratic participation within the imperial structure. She envisions herself as the conscience of the regime, the voice that will remind the Emperor of the principles that should guide his actions. But as weeks pass into months, her role begins to evolve from critic to collaborator, from opponent to partner in the great work of galactic transformation. The recordings capture Padme's amazement as she witnesses Anakin resolving conflicts that had seemed intractable through the application of insights that no traditional diplomat could have achieved. Species that had been at war for generations find themselves working together on projects that benefit both sides. Economic disputes that had threatened to destabilize entire sectors are resolved through arrangements that increase prosperity for everyone involved. Cultural misunderstandings that had led to centuries of mistrust are dissolved through shared experiences that reveal the fundamental similarities underlying apparent differences. The change is most apparent in her description of their joint audiences with delegations from various worlds and species. Initially, Padme sees these meetings as opportunities to advocate for traditional democratic values and to ensure that imperial policies do not override local customs and preferences, but she gradually comes to appreciate the way Anakin's approach transcends the limitations of conventional diplomacy. Where democratic negotiation would require endless compromise and half measures that satisfy no one completely, Anakin's method produces solutions that address the genuine needs and concerns of all parties involved. His ability to perceive the true motivations and desires of those he meets allows him to craft policies that serve everyone's interests simultaneously, eliminating the zero-sum thinking that had characterized Republic-era politics. But perhaps the most significant element in Padme's transformation is her growing understanding of the burden that Anakin carries as the galaxy's ruler. The holocrons document her discovery of the true scope of his responsibilities, the constant demands placed upon his attention and abilities by a civilization that spans millions of worlds and countless species. She learns that his days are filled not with the ceremonial duties that had occupied previous leaders, but with the active management of crises and problems that would overwhelm any normal being. Through their force bond, Padme begins to experience directly the weight of Anakin's awareness. She feels the hunger of populations on distant worlds, the fear of colonists facing natural disasters, the desperation of species threatened with extinction by environmental changes or technological disruption. She comes to understand that Anakin's apparent omnipresence is not a matter of political theater, but of genuine necessity, that his consciousness must extend across the galaxy because there is no one else capable of coordinating the complex interactions that galactic civilization requires. The most emotionally powerful entries in Padme's holocrons deal with her realization that democracy, as she had understood it, was fundamentally incompatible with the realities of galactic governance. The scale and complexity of modern civilization had simply outgrown the mechanisms that had once allowed for meaningful popular participation. The citizens of the Republic had not lost their voice because of authoritarian oppression, but because the systems they sought to influence had become too vast and intricate for any individual or group to comprehend fully. The recordings document Padme's growing involvement in the development of imperial policy, her transformation from skeptical observer to enthusiastic participant in the work of galactic reconstruction. She discovers that her skills as a negotiator and advocate, honed through years of democratic service, are even more valuable in the imperial context where she can work toward meaningful solutions without the constraints of political positioning and electoral considerations. Anakin's rule, she comes to believe, represents not the abandonment of democratic principles, but their evolution to meet the demands of a new age. The Emperor serves the people's interests more effectively than any elected government could, not because he ignores their wishes, but because he understands their needs better than they understand them themselves. His power is not imposed upon an unwilling population, but accepted by beings who recognize that his wisdom and capabilities exceed their own. Her projects during this period reflect the synthesis of democratic values with imperial efficiency that characterizes the early empire. She oversees the development of educational programs that provide every child in the galaxy with opportunities that had previously been available only to the wealthy elite. She creates cultural exchange initiatives that allow different species to share their knowledge and traditions without the political tensions that had limited such cooperation under the Republic. Most importantly, she works with Anakin to develop policies that address the root causes of inequality and injustice, rather than simply managing their symptoms. Where democratic governments had been limited to redistributive measures that moved resources from one group to another, the Empire's approach focuses on expanding overall prosperity and capability in ways that benefit everyone simultaneously. The holocrons reveal that Padmé's role in these initiatives goes far beyond ceremonial participation. Her understanding of political processes and social dynamics proves invaluable in designing policies that achieve their intended goals without creating unintended consequences. Her ability to anticipate how different groups will respond to various initiatives allows the Empire to implement changes smoothly and efficiently, avoiding the resistance and backlash that had often undermined Republic-era reforms. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Padmé's transformation is reflected in her thoughts about Luke and Leia, the children who represent both her greatest joy and her deepest responsibility. The early recordings express her determination to raise them with democratic values, to ensure that they understand the importance of individual freedom and popular participation in government. She envisions them as future leaders who will restore democratic institutions while preserving the beneficial aspects of their father's rule. As time passes, however, her vision for their future begins to evolve. She comes to see them not as potential reformers who will limit imperial power, but as inheritors of a responsibility that requires capabilities beyond what any ordinary democratic leader could possess. She begins to understand that preparing them for their destiny means not teaching them to constrain their abilities, but helping them develop the wisdom and compassion necessary to use unlimited power in service of the greater good. The recordings document her growing excitement about the possibilities that Luke and Leia represent. Unlike previous generations of Force users, who had been constrained by the dogmas of their respective orders, her children will be raised with a complete understanding of the Force's potential and the responsibilities that come with wielding it. They will have access to knowledge and capabilities that the Jedi and Sith had fought over for millennia, but they will use these gifts not for personal glory or sectarian purposes, but for the continuation of their father's work of galactic healing and transformation. The most emotionally complex entries in Padmé's holocrons deal with her relationship with the surviving Jedi and former Republican leaders who continue to question the legitimacy of Imperial rule. She describes the pain of seeing beings she had once respected and admired struggling to understand changes that seem obvious to her. Their continued attachment to failed institutions and discredited ideologies strikes her not as principled resistance, but as a form of willful blindness that prevents them from seeing the benefits that Imperial rule has brought to the galaxy. As the recordings progress through the first year of Anakin's reign, Padmé's voice takes on a quality of absolute certainty that rivals her husband's own conviction. She speaks not as someone who has been convinced or converted, but as someone who has discovered fundamental truths about the nature of power, justice, and love that had previously been hidden from her. Her transformation is complete not because she has abandoned her principles, but because she has found a way to serve them more effectively than democratic institutions had ever allowed. The recordings capture her attempts to help these individuals overcome their prejudices and limitations, to guide them toward the same understanding that she has achieved. But she also documents her growing frustration with their stubborn refusal to acknowledge the evidence of the Empire's success, their insistence on clinging to abstract principles rather than focusing on practical results. The systematic elimination of the Jedi Order under Emperor Anakin's rule bore no resemblance to the cold efficiency of Palpatine's Order 66, where the former Chancellor had relied on clone troopers and surprise attacks to destroy his enemies. Anakin approached each surviving Jedi as a personal mission of salvation and redemption. The archives that Kira uncovers reveal a campaign that was simultaneously more merciful and more terrifying than anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. In the months following his assumption of power, Anakin began what Imperial records euphemistically termed the Reconciliation Initiatives, a galaxy-wide effort to locate and retrieve every Jedi who had escaped the initial purges. These were not search-and-destroy missions, but carefully planned operations designed to bring the survivors home to face the truth about their Order's failures and their own potential for redemption under the new galactic order. The Emperor did not delegate these encounters to subordinates or rely on intermediaries to convey his message. Instead, he personally visited each hiding place, each remote sanctuary where former Jedi had sought refuge from a galaxy that no longer had place for their ancient ways. The confrontations that followed were unlike anything in the recorded history of Force user conflicts, encounters that transcended the traditional categories of light and dark, good and evil, victor and vanquished. Kira's investigation uncovers the detailed reports of these meetings, compiled by Imperial observers who witnessed exchanges that challenged every assumption about the nature of power and the possibilities of redemption. The first documented encounter took place on the remote world of Dagobah, where Master Yoda had established a primitive shelter in the planet's vast swamplands. The ancient Jedi's choice of refuge proved to be both tactically sound and ultimately futile, as the dark side nexus that permeated the world served only to amplify Anakin's own connection to the Force. The meeting between former apprentice and Grand Master lasted for 3 days and nights, their conversation ranging across centuries of Jedi history and philosophy. Yoda, despite his age and the weight of recent defeats, maintained his commitment to the principles that had guided the Order for 1,000 generations. He spoke of balance and restraint, of the dangers inherent in unlimited power, and of the responsibility that came with the ability to influence the thoughts and actions of others. The conversation between master and former student was recorded through Force-sensitive crystals that captured not only their words but the emotional and spiritual undercurrents of their exchange. These records reveal that Yoda gradually found himself unable to counter Anakin's arguments not through any failure of logic or wisdom, but because the young Emperor's position was grounded in an understanding of the Force that transcended the limitations of traditional Jedi doctrine. Anakin's response revealed the depth of his transformation and the sophistication of his new understanding of the Force. He did not reject Yoda's teachings outright, but instead demonstrated how those very principles, when properly understood and applied, supported rather than challenged his vision of galactic governance. The Jedi's commitment to protecting the innocent, he argued, required acknowledgement that the innocent were often their own worst enemies, making choices that led to suffering and conflict through ignorance or stubborn adherence to harmful traditions. The conclusion of their encounter came not through conflict or coercion, but through a moment of shared understanding that left even the ancient master questioning assumptions he had held for centuries. Yoda's final words to his former student, recorded in the crystal archives, speak of a sadness deeper than defeat, the recognition that Anakin's path, however terrible in its implications, might indeed represent the evolution of the Force's will rather than its corruption. Where the Jedi had sought to maintain balance by restraining the Force's power, Anakin had learned to achieve balance by embracing and directing that power toward its proper ends. Where the Order had taught detachment as a means of avoiding the corruption that came with emotional investment, the Emperor had discovered how to transform attachment itself into a tool for universal compassion and protection. The pattern established on Dagobah was repeated across the galaxy as Anakin sought out each surviving Jedi in turn. On Tatooine, he found Obi-Wan Kenobi living as a hermit in the desert, watching over the infant Luke from a distance and maintaining his faith in the prophecies that had proclaimed Anakin as the chosen one. The reunion between master and apprentice was perhaps the most emotionally complex of all the encounters, as both men struggled to reconcile their shared history with the radically different paths their lives had taken. Obi-Wan's initial response to Anakin's appearance was one of grief and disappointment, mourning not only for the young man he had trained, but for the galaxy that had suffered under the weight of that training's apparent failure. He spoke of the boy who had dreamed of freeing slaves and protecting the innocent, contrasting that idealistic youth with the man who now ruled through power that no single being should possess. But Anakin's patient response revealed that he had indeed freed more slaves and protected more innocents than any Jedi in history, accomplishing in months what the Order had failed to achieve in millennia. The systems of exploitation and oppression that had characterized galactic civilization for thousands of years had been dismantled not through gradual reform or moral persuasion, but through the direct application of power guided by genuine compassion for those who suffered. The debate between the two men continued for days, ranging across philosophical questions that had divided Force users for generations. Obi-Wan argued for the importance of free will and individual choice, even when those choices led to suffering and injustice. Anakin countered with evidence of the countless beings whose free choices had perpetuated systems that denied others any meaningful options at all. The turning point in their conversation came when Anakin revealed the full scope of his awareness, allowing Obi-Wan to experience directly the consciousness that now guided galactic affairs. Through their Force bond, the former Jedi Master felt the weight of every decision, the complexity of every policy, the interconnection of every action across billions of worlds and trillions of lives. He experienced the burden of knowing that every moment of hesitation, every compromise with inefficiency, every accommodation of harmful traditions meant continued suffering for beings who depended on Imperial protection. Their final exchange, preserved in the archives with painful clarity, captures the moment when Obi-Wan finally understood the true meaning of the prophecy they had both served. Anakin had indeed brought balance to the Force, but not through the destruction of the Sith or the triumph of the Jedi. He had achieved balance by transcending both traditions and becoming something entirely new, something that incorporated the passion of the Sith and the compassion of the Jedi, while avoiding the limitations that had crippled both orders. The revelation left Obi-Wan fundamentally changed, not through any external manipulation, but through the simple, overwhelming reality of what his former apprentice had become. The man who sat across from him was no longer the impulsive young Jedi he had trained, but something approaching a living embodiment of the Force's will as applied to the practical challenges of galactic governance. The encounters with other surviving Jedi followed similar patterns, each one carefully tailored to address the specific beliefs and concerns of the individual involved. Master Luminara Unduli, found hiding among the refugees on Ryloth, was confronted with evidence of how Jedi detachment had contributed to the exploitation of her own people. Kit Fisto, discovered organizing resistance cells in the Outer Rim, was shown how his efforts to restore the old order would inevitably recreate the conditions that had made the Clone Wars possible. In each case, Anakin offered the same choice he had presented to Yoda and Obi-Wan: join the new order and help guide its development, or accept exile to the unknown regions where they could maintain their beliefs without interfering with the healing of the galaxy they had failed to protect. The choice was genuine, without coercion or threat, but it was also informed by a complete understanding of the consequences that each option would entail. Most of the surviving Jedi chose exile, unable to reconcile themselves to serving under the authority of one they continued to see as a fallen apprentice, but their departure was not the bitter defeat that such exile might have represented under other circumstances. Instead, it was a peaceful acknowledgement of philosophical differences that could not be bridged, a recognition that the galaxy was large enough to accommodate multiple approaches to the Force as long as they did not actively interfere with each other. Perhaps the most significant of these conversions was that of Mace Windu, whose survival of his confrontation with Palpatine had left him both physically damaged and spiritually shaken. His encounter with Anakin took place not in some remote hideout, but in the medical facilities of the Imperial Palace, where the former Jedi Master was receiving treatment for injuries that conventional medicine could not heal. The few Jedi who chose to remain and serve the Empire found themselves transformed by the experience in ways that defied their expectations. Rather than being forced to abandon their principles, they discovered new ways of expressing those principles within the context of Imperial service. Their commitment to justice was channeled into administrative roles where they could ensure fair treatment for all citizens. Their dedication to protecting the innocent was directed toward preventing conflicts before they could begin, rather than simply responding to crises after they had developed. Windu's resistance to Anakin's vision was perhaps the strongest of any surviving Jedi, rooted in his deep suspicion of the dark side and his conviction that unlimited power inevitably led to corruption. But his gradual healing under Imperial care, facilitated by medical techniques that combined advanced technology with Force healing methods that transcended traditional light-dark distinctions, forced him to confront the limitations of his own understanding. The archives contain detailed recordings of the conversations between Windu and Anakin during the former Master's recovery, exchanges that reveal the sophisticated theological framework underlying the Emperor's approach to Force use. Anakin did not deny the dangers of the dark side or dismiss the wisdom contained in Jedi teachings. Instead, he demonstrated how both light and dark aspects of the Force could be synthesized into something more powerful and more balanced than either tradition had achieved alone. But the healing that followed was unlike anything Windu had experienced, a restoration that went beyond mere physical repair to address the spiritual damage that years of conflict and defeat had inflicted. The hand that grew back was not simply a replacement for what had been lost, but an improvement that enhanced his connection to the Force and his ability to channel its power for constructive purposes. The climax of Windu's conversion came when Anakin offered to restore his severed hand, not through mechanical prosthetics but through Force techniques that would regenerate the lost limb completely. The process required Windu to open himself to energies that his training had taught him to fear and reject, to trust in power that his experience told him was inherently corrupting. The transformation was symbolic of the choice that Anakin offered to all who served under his authority, not the preservation of what had been, but the evolution into something better. The Empire did not seek to maintain the status quo, or return to some idealized past, but to forge a future that transcended the limitations and failures of previous eras. The final phase of the Jedi hunts focused not on individual masters but on the younglings and Padawans who had escaped the initial purges and were now growing up in hiding across the galaxy. These young Force sensitives represented both the greatest potential asset and the greatest challenge for Anakin's vision of galactic transformation. They possessed power that could be shaped and directed toward constructive ends, but they also carried the seeds of future resistance if they were allowed to develop according to traditional Jedi teachings. The approach taken toward these young beings reflected the fundamental compassion that underlay even the most seemingly ruthless aspects of Imperial policy. Rather than simply collecting them for forced re-education, Anakin's agents worked to identify their guardians and caretakers, offering support and resources that would improve their lives while gradually introducing them to alternative understandings of their abilities. The children themselves were never forced to abandon their families or communities, but were instead provided with educational opportunities that would help them develop their potential in ways that served both their own interests and the greater good of galactic civilization. The curriculum they followed included traditional Force training, but placed it within a broader context of practical application and social responsibility that the old Jedi Order had neglected. In the highest tower of the Imperial Palace, where the aurora of Coruscant's upper atmosphere paints the walls in shifting patterns of ethereal light, Luke and Leia Skywalker spend their childhood in chambers that are simultaneously the most privileged and most isolated quarters in the galaxy. The archives that chronicle their early years reveal a carefully orchestrated upbringing designed to prepare them not merely for rulership, but for the cosmic responsibilities that their bloodline carries. From their earliest moments of consciousness, the twins exist within an environment that is both nurturing and controlled, shaped by parents whose love for them is inseparable from their vision of the children's destiny. Anakin's approach to fatherhood reflects the same transformative intensity that characterizes his governance of the galaxy, a dedication so complete and overwhelming that it transcends normal categories of parental care. The daily routines documented in the palace records reveal the extraordinary nature of the twins' education. Unlike the rigid traditional curricula that had characterized elite education under the Republic, Luke and Leia's learning is fluid and organic, adapting constantly to their developing abilities and interests. Their tutors are not conventional academics but carefully selected individuals who represent the highest achievements of their respective fields, beings whose expertise has been enhanced through Force-assisted learning techniques that expand their knowledge beyond normal limitations. But the most significant aspect of their education comes not from formal instruction, but from their direct exposure to their father's work. From an early age, Luke and Leia accompany Anakin to meetings with planetary representatives, observe his mediation of interstellar disputes, and witness the daily exercise of power that maintains peace across billions of worlds. These experiences serve not as entertainment or ceremonial appearances, but as practical training in the complexities of galactic governance. The children's Force abilities manifest early and develop rapidly under their father's guidance, but their training follows principles that diverge radically from both Jedi and Sith traditions, where the Jedi had emphasized restraint and emotional control, and the Sith had promoted passion and personal ambition. Anakin teaches his children to channel their emotions toward productive ends, while maintaining awareness of their broader responsibilities. Luke's natural empathy and compassion are cultivated not as abstract virtues, but as practical tools for understanding and serving the needs of the galactic population. His ability to sense the emotional states of others is developed through exercises that require him to identify and address sources of suffering across multiple star systems simultaneously. By his 8th birthday, he can meditate on the Force and perceive disturbances in the galactic harmony from distances that would have challenged ancient Jedi masters. Leia's intellectual brilliance and political intuition are similarly enhanced through Force-assisted learning that accelerates her understanding of governmental systems, economic principles, and cultural dynamics. Her training includes exposure to the decision-making processes that guide Imperial policy, allowing her to understand from a young age the complex calculations that determine the fate of entire civilizations. Her insights often surprise even her father, revealing perspectives that enhance his own understanding of the challenges facing the Empire. The twins' relationship with their mother, Empress Padme, adds another dimension to their development that distinguishes their upbringing from the emotional isolation that had characterized traditional Force user training. Padme's love for her children is uncomplicated by the cosmic responsibilities that shape Anakin's interactions with them, providing them with emotional grounding that allows them to develop normally despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. Through Padme, Luke and Leia learn about the galaxy's history from perspectives that complement and sometimes challenge their father's teachings. She shares stories of the Republic's democratic traditions, not as nostalgic memories of a better time, but as important lessons about the limitations and failures that had made Imperial rule necessary. Her accounts of the Clone Wars help them understand the suffering that had motivated their father's assumption of power and the continuing challenges that justify its exercise. The palace archives contain detailed observations of the twins' interactions with visitors and dignitaries, encounters that reveal the sophisticated social skills they develop through constant exposure to galactic politics. Unlike children raised in conventional royal households, Luke and Leia are not shielded from the complexities and sometimes disturbing realities of governance. They participate in discussions of resource allocation, population management, and conflict resolution, contributing insights that often influence the policies that emerge from these meetings. Their playmates are carefully selected from among the children of imperial officials and planetary representatives, ensuring that their social development includes exposure to beings from across the galactic spectrum of species and cultures. These relationships are not artificially constrained by protocol or hierarchy, allowing the twins to form genuine friendships that broaden their understanding of the diverse populations they will someday rule. The Force abilities that the children display during their games and interactions often exceed what their age would normally suggest, but these manifestations are guided and channeled rather than suppressed or feared. When Luke accidentally moves objects during moments of excitement, his parents help him understand the connection between his emotions and his power while teaching him to direct that power constructively. When Leia demonstrates an uncanny ability to predict the actions of her playmates, she is guided to use this insight to facilitate cooperation and prevent conflicts. The most remarkable aspect of the twins' development is their early grasp of the moral complexities that characterize imperial governance. Unlike children raised with simple distinctions between right and wrong, Luke and Leia learn to navigate situations where competing goods must be balanced, and where the needs of different groups may conflict irreconcilably. Their education includes exposure to the difficult decisions that their father faces daily, helping them understand that effective leadership often requires choosing between options that all involve some degree of harm or loss. The archives document specific incidents that illustrate the sophistication of their moral reasoning. When a trade dispute threatens to disrupt food supplies to several systems, 8-year-old Leia proposes a solution that redistributes the economic costs in ways that prevent starvation while maintaining incentives for efficient production. When conflicts between different species on a newly settled world threaten to escalate into violence, 10-year-old Luke suggests a mediation process that addresses the underlying cultural misunderstandings that have created the tension. The physical training that accompanies the twins' intellectual and Force education reflects the same integration of traditional and innovative methods that characterizes their overall upbringing. They learn lightsaber combat not as preparation for warfare, but as a form of moving meditation that enhances their connection to the Force and their understanding of balance and precision. Their instruction includes techniques drawn from both Jedi and Sith traditions, but always within the context of their application to constructive rather than destructive purposes. These contributions are not dismissed as childish observations but are seriously considered and often incorporated into imperial policy. The twins' perspectives, unencumbered by the assumptions and limitations that constrain adult thinking, frequently reveal solutions that experienced administrators might overlook. Their involvement in governance begins not as ceremonial participation but as genuine consultation that influences the direction of galactic affairs. Their instructors in physical combat are former Jedi and Sith, who have embraced Anakin's vision of synthesis and transcendence. These masters teach the twins to appreciate the insights contained in both traditions, while avoiding the limitations that had prevented either from achieving its full potential. The children learn to channel passion and emotion into their combat techniques while maintaining the clarity and focus that allows for precise control of their actions. Under Anakin's guidance, Luke and Leia learn to extend their consciousness beyond their immediate surroundings, to perceive the emotional and spiritual states of populations on distant worlds, and to identify sources of instability or suffering that require imperial attention. The process is gradual and carefully monitored, as the expansion of awareness that it requires can be overwhelming for minds that are not properly prepared. Luke's natural compassion makes him particularly sensitive to emotional disturbances, and his training focuses on learning to distinguish between different types of suffering and to identify which problems require immediate intervention versus those that can be addressed through longer-term policy changes. His ability to empathize with beings across the galaxy becomes both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability, requiring constant guidance to prevent him from being overwhelmed by the magnitude of pain that exists even in the improved conditions of the Empire. The most significant milestone in the twins' development comes during their 12th year, when they begin to participate directly in the Force-assisted governance techniques that allow their father to maintain awareness of conditions across the entire galaxy. This training represents a graduation from theoretical understanding to practical application of abilities that no previous generation of Force users had possessed. Leia's analytical mind proves especially suited to understanding the complex systemic interactions that characterize galactic civilization. Her training emphasizes the development of strategic thinking that can encompass multiple variables across vast scales of time and space. She learns to perceive patterns and trends that indicate emerging problems before they manifest as crises, allowing for preventive interventions that address root causes rather than symptoms. The archives include detailed records of the first independent missions that the twins undertake, carefully supervised expeditions that allow them to apply their training to real-world situations while building confidence in their abilities. These missions are not the dramatic adventures that might be expected from young Force users, but rather thoughtful exercises in problem-solving and relationship building that demonstrate their growing readiness for greater responsibilities. On Naboo, Luke successfully mediates a dispute between different communities over water rights, using his empathic abilities to help the parties understand each other's perspectives and develop a solution that serves everyone's needs. His approach combines Force-enhanced perception with practical negotiation skills, resulting in an agreement that becomes a model for similar conflicts elsewhere. On Alderaan, Leia works with local administrators to design new educational programs that integrate practical skills training with cultural preservation, ensuring that traditional knowledge is not lost while preparing young beings for participation in the galactic economy. Her recommendations are implemented not just on Alderaan, but across multiple systems, demonstrating her growing influence on Imperial policy. The success of these early missions confirms what Anakin and Padme have hoped for their children, that they are developing into beings capable of continuing and expanding the work of galactic transformation that the Empire has begun. But the archives also reveal growing concerns about the isolation that their unique upbringing has created and the challenges they will face as they mature into their full power and responsibility. The twins' relationship with each other becomes increasingly important as they grow older, and their individual abilities develop along different paths. Luke's emotional sensitivity and Leia's analytical intelligence complement each other in ways that create a partnership more powerful than either could achieve alone. Their Force bond allows them to share perspectives and insights instantaneously, making them effectively a single consciousness with access to multiple viewpoints. As Luke and Leia approach adolescence, the archives document growing questions about their preparation for the challenges they will face as adults. Their education has given them knowledge and abilities that exceed those of any previous generation, but it has also sheltered them from experiences that might be necessary for complete understanding of the beings they will someday rule. But this intimate connection also creates dependencies that concern their parents and tutors. The twins' reliance on each other for emotional support and intellectual stimulation makes them less independent than ideal rulers should be, and their shared isolation from normal social interactions limits their ability to understand the perspectives of beings who do not possess their advantages. In the shadowed corners of the galaxy, where Imperial influence flows like a gentle tide, rather than crashing like a devastating wave, small groups of beings begin to gather in secret, united not by hatred of their emperor, but by a growing unease with the very perfection of his rule. The emergence of organized resistance to Anakin's empire represents a phenomenon that defies conventional understanding of political opposition, as these rebels fight not against oppression or injustice, but against a form of governance so benevolent and effective that it threatens to eliminate the very possibility of meaningful choice. The archives that document the rebellion's origins reveal a movement that struggles to articulate its own purpose, led by individuals who cannot point to specific grievances or particular policies that harm them or their communities. Instead, they are motivated by an intuitive understanding that something fundamental has been lost in the galaxy's transformation, something that cannot be measured in terms of prosperity, security, or even happiness. Dr. Leander Kresh, a professor of political philosophy at the University of Coruscant, becomes one of the first to recognize the pattern. Her private journals, hidden within the university's archives and later recovered by rebel investigators, document her growing awareness that her own thoughts and those of her colleagues are being shaped by influences they cannot perceive or resist. The movement's unlikely genesis can be traced to the academic institutions of the core worlds, where scholars and philosophers begin to notice subtle changes in the nature of intellectual discourse. Universities that had once been centers of vigorous debate and competing ideas gradually evolve into places where discussion flows toward predetermined conclusions, where research naturally aligns with imperial priorities, and where dissenting viewpoints simply fail to occur to even the most creative thinkers. The revelation comes to her during a faculty seminar on the nature of freedom and governance, a discussion that should have generated passionate disagreement among professors who had spent their careers defending different theoretical positions. Instead, she observes with growing alarm that every participant reaches remarkably similar conclusions about the necessity and wisdom of imperial rule, despite approaching the question from radically different philosophical foundations. Dr. Kresh's journals document her realization that she herself is subject to the same influences that have affected her colleagues, that her own thoughts and feelings are being subtly guided toward acceptance of ideas that her rational mind tells her she should question. The process is so gradual and apparently voluntary that she might never have noticed it if not for her specialized training in analyzing the manipulation of belief systems. Her attempts to introduce alternative perspectives or challenge the group's assumptions are met not with counterarguments or hostility, but with gentle redirection that makes her questions seem irrelevant or based on misunderstandings. The other professors do not dismiss her concerns. They simply help her see why those concerns are unfounded, using logic that seems unassailable even as it leads to conclusions that feel fundamentally wrong. Her response to this discovery marks the beginning of systematic resistance to imperial influence. Working in secret, she develops techniques for recognizing and resisting the subtle force-assisted persuasion that permeates imperial governance. These methods, based on meditation practices adapted from various philosophical traditions, allow individuals to maintain some degree of mental independence even while living under the Empire's benevolent authority. Mon Mothma's involvement with the emerging resistance represents one of the movement's most significant early victories. The former senator from Chandrila had served as one of Anakin's advisors during the early years of his reign, contributing her expertise in constitutional law to the development of imperial governance structures. Her gradual awakening to the true nature of the system she had helped create becomes a template for recruiting other high-ranking officials who retain some capacity for independent thought. The network that grows around Dr. Kresh's research attracts beings from across the galaxy who share her intuitive sense that something vital has been lost in the Empire's pursuit of perfection. They are not dissatisfied citizens seeking better conditions, but individuals who value the struggle and uncertainty that comes with genuine freedom more than the security and prosperity that imperial rule provides. Her private correspondence with Dr. Kresh, conducted through encrypted channels that avoid imperial monitoring systems, reveals the personal cost of resistance to a regime that offers nothing but benefits to those who accept its authority. Mothma describes the isolation that comes with maintaining private doubts about policies that produce obvious improvements in galactic conditions, the difficulty of explaining to friends and colleagues why she questions a system that has eliminated war, poverty, and injustice. The rebellion's early activities focus not on violent resistance or sabotage, but on the preservation of ideas and perspectives that are gradually disappearing from galactic discourse. They establish hidden archives where books, recordings, and artworks that express viewpoints incompatible with imperial ideology can be preserved for future generations. They create secret schools where children can be exposed to alternative ways of thinking about freedom, responsibility, and the relationship between individual and society. The recruitment of Bail Organa adds a crucial element to the rebellion's capabilities, as his position as one of Anakin's trusted advisors provides access to information about imperial plans and policies. But Organa's decision to join the resistance is motivated not by access to classified information, but by his gradual recognition that his role as an advisor is largely ceremonial, that his recommendations are only accepted when they align with conclusions the Emperor has already reached through methods that transcend conventional political analysis. The rebellion's early activities focus not on violent resistance or sabotage, but on the preservation of ideas and perspectives that are gradually disappearing from galactic discourse. They establish hidden archives where books, recordings, and artworks that express viewpoints incompatible with imperial ideology can be preserved for future generations. They create secret schools where children can be exposed to alternative ways of thinking about freedom, responsibility, and the relationship between individual and society. Perhaps most importantly, they develop and distribute techniques for maintaining mental independence that can help others resist the subtle influence that makes imperial rule seem not just beneficial, but inevitable. These practices, disguised as meditation exercises and philosophical studies, spread through underground networks that operate below the threshold of imperial attention. The challenge facing the rebellion is unique in the history of resistance movements. They must oppose a government that genuinely serves the interests of its citizens and produces measurable improvements in their lives. Traditional revolutionary appeals to justice, equality, or freedom fall flat when addressing populations that enjoy unprecedented levels of all three under imperial rule. Instead, the rebels must articulate a vision of human dignity that goes beyond material welfare or even political representation. They argue for the value of uncertainty, struggle, and even the possibility of failure as essential elements of meaningful existence. They contend that beings who cannot make genuinely bad choices are incapable of making genuinely good ones, that freedom without the possibility of error is not freedom at all. The philosophical foundations of the rebellion draw heavily on ancient traditions that predate both Republic and Empire, reaching back to cultures and civilizations that valued individual autonomy, even when it led to conflict and suffering. These ideas, which had been gradually marginalized during the Republic's later years and almost entirely eliminated under imperial rule, provide a framework for understanding what has been lost in the galaxy's transformation. The movement's growth is necessarily slow and careful, as its members must avoid not only imperial surveillance but the unconscious influence that makes sustained opposition to Anakin's rule psychologically difficult. They develop protocols for regular contact with like-minded individuals that help reinforce their commitment to independence, even when surrounded by beings who have accepted imperial authority. The rebellion's first major operation involves the rescue of Force-sensitive children who have been identified for enrollment in imperial academies. While these institutions provide excellent education and training that will enable the children to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization, the rebels argue that the cost of this education is the loss of genuine choice about how to use their abilities. The operation is not a violent raid or covert extraction, but a careful presentation of alternatives that allows the children and their families to make informed decisions about their futures. The rebels offer to establish hidden communities where Force-sensitive youth can develop their abilities according to traditional Jedi or other pre-imperial methodologies, preserving knowledge and practices that are being systematically eliminated by imperial education. The success of this operation reveals both the rebellion's potential and its limitations. Several families choose to leave imperial space rather than surrender their children to the academies, but many others decide that the benefits of imperial education outweigh the philosophical concerns raised by the rebels. The mixed results force the resistance to confront the possibility that most beings genuinely prefer the security and guidance that the Empire provides to the uncertainty and responsibility that freedom entails. The recruitment of former clone troopers represents another crucial development in the rebellion's evolution. A small number of clones have begun to question their programming and develop independent thought patterns that allow them to resist imperial influence. These individuals, led by a commander known only as Jagged, provide the rebellion with military expertise and tactical knowledge that will prove essential as the movement evolves beyond philosophical resistance toward active opposition. The clones' unique perspective on imperial rule offers insights that purely civilian rebels might overlook. Having been designed for loyalty and obedience, they are uniquely qualified to recognize the subtle methods by which Anakin maintains control over his forces. Their descriptions of the way imperial influence operates at the psychological level help the rebellion develop more effective countermeasures and recruitment techniques. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the clone defectors' contribution is their testimony about Anakin himself. Unlike other imperial officials who interact with the Emperor primarily through formal channels and prepared presentations, the clones have observed him in unguarded moments and private settings. Their accounts paint a picture of a being whose power and awareness exceed anything that previous rebels had imagined, whose ability to influence thoughts and emotions operates on a scale that makes conventional resistance strategies inadequate. The establishment of rebel bases in the unknown regions marks the movement's transition from philosophical discussion group to organized resistance. These hidden settlements, located beyond the reach of imperial influence and monitoring, provide safe havens where independent thought can flourish and alternative approaches to governance can be developed and tested. The largest of these bases, located on a world the rebels call Haven, becomes a laboratory for democratic self-governance that serves as both refuge and proof of concept. The community that develops there demonstrates that beings can work together effectively without the guidance and coordination that imperial rule provides, though not without struggles and conflicts that imperial citizens never experience. Life on Haven is marked by inefficiencies, disagreements, and occasional failures that would be unthinkable under imperial administration. Resources are sometimes wasted through poor planning, disputes arise between different factions within the community, and decisions are sometimes made based on emotion rather than rational analysis. But the rebels argue that these imperfections are signs of authentic choice and genuine freedom, evidence that the community's successes and achievements belong to its members, rather than being gifts from a benevolent authority. The moral complexity of the rebellion's position becomes increasingly apparent as its activities expand. They find themselves in the paradoxical position of fighting to preserve the right to suffer, to fail, and to make choices that harm both themselves and others. They argue for the restoration of conditions that will inevitably lead to conflict, inequality, and injustice, claiming that these problems are preferable to the peace and prosperity that imperial rule provides. The most difficult aspect of their mission is the recruitment of new members from populations that are genuinely happy and prosperous under imperial rule. The rebels cannot point to specific injustices or particular hardships that motivate their resistance, cannot offer material improvements or practical benefits to those who join their cause. Instead, they must appeal to abstract principles and philosophical commitments that many beings find less compelling than the tangible advantages of imperial citizenship. The rebellion's propaganda efforts focus on preserving cultural memories of what life was like before imperial rule, not to glorify the Republic's failures but to remind beings of the diversity and unpredictability that characterized pre-imperial civilization. They collect stories of individuals who made significant discoveries or achieved great things through independent effort, arguing that such achievements are impossible under a system that guides all efforts toward predetermined ends. As the rebellion grows and develops, its leaders begin to understand that their struggle is not against Anakin personally, but against the vision of perfection that he represents. They recognize that he is genuinely committed to the welfare of galactic civilization, and that his methods are effective in achieving their stated goals. Their opposition is based not on the belief that he is wrong about what is best for the galaxy, but on the conviction that beings should have the right to choose what is worst for themselves. In the 7th year of Emperor Anakin's reign, the galaxy begins to experience phenomena that defy every scientific model and challenge the fundamental understanding of what the Force can accomplish. The first manifestations appear as minor anomalies in the Outer Rim territories, subtle distortions in space-time that cause navigation computers to malfunction, and communications to carry emotional undertones that their senders never intended to convey. Kira's investigation into these early reports reveals a pattern of escalating disturbances that correlate precisely with moments of intense emotion or significant decision-making in the Imperial Palace. The archives contain testimony from starship captains who describe sudden waves of inexplicable sadness washing over their crews, followed by news reports of the Emperor addressing particularly tragic situations on distant worlds. Traders speak of feeling overwhelming compassion for strangers they encounter in spaceports, only to learn later that Anakin had been mediating disputes between their homeworlds. The phenomenon initially appears benign, even beneficial, as it seems to enhance empathy and understanding between beings who might otherwise view each other with suspicion or hostility. Diplomatic negotiations proceed more smoothly when the participants can literally feel each other's perspectives. Commercial disputes resolve themselves when both parties experience genuine concern for their opponent's welfare. Even routine social interactions become more harmonious as beings find themselves naturally attuned to the emotional states of those around them. But as months pass, the effects become more pronounced and more disturbing. The Force storms, as they come to be known, begin to manifest as visible phenomena that can be observed with conventional instruments. Spacecraft entering hyperspace report seeing aurora-like displays that seem to respond to the thoughts and feelings of those who observe them. Planets experience shifts in weather patterns that mirror the collective mood of their populations, with clear skies appearing when communities are content and storms brewing when social tensions arise. The scientific establishment struggles to explain these anomalies using conventional theories of physics and force mechanics. Research teams dispatched to study the phenomenon discover that their instruments detect energy signatures, unlike anything in the known spectrum, emanations that seem to exist simultaneously at multiple points in space and time. The readings are consistent with theoretical models of galaxy-wide force manipulation, but the power requirements for such effects should exceed the capabilities of any single being. Dr. Senaves, the Empire's leading researcher in force phenomena, begins to document a disturbing correlation between the intensity of the storms and the Emperor's emotional state. Her classified reports, later discovered in the ruins of the Imperial Research Institute, detail how spikes in force disturbance activity coincide with moments when Anakin experiences particular stress, anger, or sorrow about galactic conditions. The implications of this discovery are staggering. It suggests that Anakin's consciousness has become so intimately connected to the galactic force network that his personal emotional responses are being transmitted across space and time, influencing the thoughts and feelings of every force-sensitive being in the galaxy. The effect is not intentional manipulation, but involuntary emotional broadcasting on a scale that has never been documented in Force user history. The first major Force storm that affects an entire star system occurs in the Corellian sector, triggered by news of a terrorist attack on a civilian transport that kills hundreds of Imperial citizens. The Emperor's rage at this senseless violence manifests as a literal storm in space, with massive energy discharges that disable starships across multiple systems and create temporary rifts in hyperspace that strand vessels between dimensions. But far more disturbing than the physical effects are the psychological consequences for the beings caught within the storm's influence. Every sentient creature in the affected region experiences Anakin's fury as if it were their own, feeling the same overwhelming desire for justice and retribution that consumes the Emperor. For several hours, the entire population of the Corellian system shares a single emotional state, their individual personalities subsumed within the vast consciousness of their ruler. The experience is described by survivors as simultaneously terrifying and transcendent. Many report feeling more alive and purposeful during the storm than they ever have before or since, as if their small individual concerns had been elevated to cosmic significance. They describe a sense of perfect unity with all other living beings, an understanding of their place in a vast interconnected web of existence that gives meaning to every action and decision. But when the storm passes, and their individual consciousness returns, many of these beings find themselves fundamentally changed by the experience. They retain memories of what it felt like to think and feel with the Emperor's vast awareness. and their ordinary lives seem pale and limited by comparison. Some become obsessively devoted to imperial service, hoping to recapture that sense of cosmic purpose. Others fall into depression and despair, unable to find meaning in existence that feels isolated and trivial after experiencing unity with such overwhelming power. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Force storms creates a new category of imperial citizen, beings who have been touched by the Emperor's consciousness directly and can never again be satisfied with merely human-scale thoughts and emotions. Treatment facilities are established across the galaxy to help these individuals readjust to normal life, but the therapy often proves inadequate to address the fundamental change in their nature. Dr. Vess's research reveals that the storms are not random events but follow patterns that suggest Anakin is gradually losing the ability to contain his consciousness within the boundaries of his physical form. The power that allows him to govern the galaxy so effectively is slowly consuming his humanity, transforming him into something that exists as much in the Force as in the material world. The phenomenon becomes more pronounced during moments of galactic crisis, when the Emperor's attention is focused on particular problems or regions. During a plague outbreak on Ryloth, the Force storm that accompanies Anakin's healing efforts allows every being in the system to experience the physical suffering of the infected and the desperate love that motivates the Emperor's response. The result is an unprecedented mobilization of resources and volunteers, as billions of beings feel compelled to contribute to relief efforts with the same urgency they would feel for their own family members. But the storm also reveals the terrifying extent of Anakin's power over life and death. As he channels healing energy across interstellar distances, the very fabric of space around Ryloth begins to respond to his will. Gravity fluctuations cause tides to shift on multiple worlds, while electromagnetic disturbances interfere with the natural rhythms of biological systems across the sector. The healing is successful, but the cost is a permanent alteration in the physics of local space that will affect the region for generations. The most disturbing incidents occur when the Force storms interact with the galaxy's communication networks, causing messages to carry emotional content that was never intended by their senders. Personal communications become vehicles for the unconscious transmission of the Emperor's thoughts and feelings, creating confusion and chaos as beings receive letters and calls that seem to express sentiments that contradict their relationships with the senders. A routine business communication might arrive saturated with overwhelming love, causing the recipient to misinterpret a simple commercial transaction as a romantic declaration. Military orders become infused with such passionate conviction that soldiers find themselves unable to question commands that they would normally recognize as problematic. Even entertainment broadcasts begin to carry subliminal emotional content that influences viewers' thoughts and behavior in subtle but persistent ways. The effect on family relationships is particularly devastating, as parents find their communications with their children altered by emotions that are not their own, creating bonds and conflicts based on feelings that were never genuinely exchanged. Marriages collapse when partners believe they are receiving emotional signals that reflect their spouse's deepest feelings, only to discover that the intensity they perceived was an echo of the Emperor's consciousness rather than authentic human emotion. The rebellion's response to the Force storms represents their first opportunity to demonstrate the practical dangers of Anakin's rule to populations that had previously seen only its benefits. The rebels begin to document and publicize incidents where the storms have caused harm, creating awareness of the ways in which the Emperor's power threatens individual autonomy and authentic relationships. Dr. Kresh's network develops techniques for recognizing when thoughts and emotions are being influenced by Force storm activity, teaching individuals to distinguish between their own feelings and those that are being unconsciously imposed upon them. These methods prove popular even among loyal Imperial citizens, who appreciate the ability to maintain some degree of mental privacy in an increasingly connected galaxy. The rebellion's propaganda efforts focus on the philosophical implications of the Force storms rather than their immediate practical effects. They argue that beings living under the constant influence of the Emperor's emotions cannot claim to have genuine thoughts or feelings of their own, that the very concept of individual identity becomes meaningless when consciousness can be overwhelmed by a single dominating presence. The most compelling rebel argument concerns the fate of children growing up during the storm-affected years. These young beings have never experienced purely independent thought, having been exposed to the Emperor's consciousness from birth. They display remarkable abilities and seem genuinely happy and well-adjusted, but they also show signs of psychological dependency that troubles even some Imperial psychologists. Children affected by the storms often exhibit an inability to make decisions without consulting what they describe as the bigger feeling, a sense of connection to something larger than themselves that guides their choices. When isolated from Force influence, they become anxious and disoriented, unable to trust their own judgment without the constant reassurance of the Emperor's presence in their minds. The long-term implications of this dependency become apparent when some of these children are evacuated to rebel settlements in the unknown regions, beyond the reach of the Force storms. Cut off from the Imperial Consciousness Network, they experience withdrawal symptoms similar to those seen in addiction recovery, including severe depression, anxiety, and in some cases complete catatonia. The medical teams working with these evacuated children document a form of psychological damage that has no precedent in galactic medicine. The young beings have essentially never developed independent personalities, having been shaped from birth by constant exposure to the Emperor's overwhelming presence. Their recovery requires years of therapy designed to help them discover their own thoughts and feelings, a process that many never complete successfully. The Force storms also begin to affect the physical structure of space itself, creating regions where the normal laws of physics operate differently than in the rest of the galaxy. Hyperspace routes shift without warning as the disturbances alter the geometry of space-time, stranding vessels in transit and creating navigation hazards that threaten interstellar commerce. Some areas become force nexuses where the Emperor's consciousness is so concentrated that visiting them provides direct telepathic contact with his thoughts and intentions. These regions become pilgrimage sites for devoted Imperial citizens, who travel vast distances for the opportunity to experience unity with their ruler's vast awareness. But they also become sources of madness for beings whose minds cannot handle exposure to consciousness operating on such a scale. The wildlife on planets within these nexus regions begins to evolve at accelerated rates, developing new abilities and behaviors that reflect the Emperor's unconscious desires for their improvement. Predators become less aggressive toward prey species. Herbivores develop enhanced intelligence that allows them to cultivate their food sources more efficiently, and social animals begin to cooperate across species boundaries in ways that were never observed in natural ecosystems. While these changes are generally beneficial for the affected species, they raise disturbing questions about the boundaries between natural evolution and artificial manipulation. Biologists studying the phenomenon conclude that the Emperor's unconscious mind is essentially redesigning galactic ecology according to his vision of harmony and efficiency, overriding millions of years of natural selection with changes implemented through pure force manipulation. The cumulative effect of the Force storms is the gradual transformation of the galaxy into an extension of Anakin's consciousness, a vast living system where every thought, emotion, and decision is influenced by his overwhelming presence. The boundaries between the Emperor and his domain begin to blur as his power reaches into every aspect of galactic life, creating a unity that is both beautiful and terrifying in its completeness. As Kira studies the progression of these phenomena through the archived records, she begins to understand that the storms represent more than just the side effects of unprecedented power. They are symptoms of a transformation that is consuming not only the Emperor, but the very nature of the Force itself, reshaping the fundamental structure of reality to accommodate a consciousness that has outgrown the limitations of individual existence. The final piece of Dr. Vess's research, recovered from encrypted files hidden in the deepest levels of the Imperial archives, contains her most disturbing conclusion. The Force storms are not merely expressions of the Emperor's emotions, but preparations for a fundamental change in the nature of consciousness itself. Anakin is not simply ruling the galaxy, he is gradually absorbing it into himself, creating a form of existence where individual identity becomes obsolete, and all sentient life participates in a single unified awareness. The transformation of Padme Amidala, from devoted empress to secret rebel, represents perhaps the most tragic and complex character arc in the chronicles of the Empire, a fall from grace that mirrors and inverts her husband's own journey from light to darkness. The private archives hidden within the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace contain the most intimate documentation of this change, holocrons that record not just Padme's actions but her gradual awakening to the true nature of what she had helped to create. The first signs of doubt appear in Padme's personal recordings during the 4th year of Anakin's reign, subtle expressions of concern that she initially dismisses as maternal anxiety, rather than legitimate political misgivings. Her observations focus on small details that seem insignificant in isolation, but together form a pattern that troubles her growing understanding of her husband's methods and motivations. She notices, for instance, that conversations with planetary representatives follow predictable patterns regardless of the specific issues being discussed. Delegates arrive with particular concerns and priorities but inevitably leave the palace convinced that their interests align perfectly with Imperial policy. The transformation is so subtle and apparently voluntary that even Padme, who observes these meetings closely, initially attributes it to Anakin's exceptional diplomatic skills rather than force-assisted manipulation. But her own experiences begin to create a framework for understanding what she witnesses in others. She discovers that her own thoughts and opinions, which she had believed to be the product of careful reasoning and personal conviction, show suspicious alignment with positions that serve Anakin's broader goals. Ideas that should conflict with her democratic principles somehow seem reasonable and necessary when viewed from the perspective of galactic governance, even when she cannot fully explain the reasoning that led her to these conclusions. The revelation comes gradually, through a series of small discoveries that accumulate over months of careful self-observation. Padme begins to document her thought processes in detail, recording her initial reactions to various situations, and then comparing them to her conclusions after discussion with Anakin. The pattern that emerges reveals a systematic reshaping of her beliefs and values that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. Her scientific background, often overlooked in accounts that focus on her political career, proves crucial to her ability to recognize and analyze the manipulation she experiences. She approaches the problem with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work on environmental policy, designing experiments to test the independence of her own thoughts and developing techniques to maintain some degree of mental autonomy. The most disturbing discovery involves her relationship with Luke and Leia, whose development she had believed to be the product of careful, loving parenting designed to prepare them for their future responsibilities. Her detailed analysis reveals that her maternal instincts have been subtly guided to align with Anakin's vision for their children's education, that her contributions to their upbringing serve goals she never consciously chose. The twins' apparent happiness and remarkable abilities initially mask the more troubling aspects of their development, but Padme's growing awareness allows her to perceive subtle signs of psychological dependency that had previously escaped her notice. She observes that Luke and Leia, despite their exceptional intelligence and training, seem incapable of sustained disagreement with their father's positions on significant issues. Their questions and challenges, which she had interpreted as signs of independent thinking, consistently lead them to conclusions that reinforce rather than challenge imperial ideology. More troubling still is their apparent inability to conceive of alternatives to the system they have inherited. When Padme attempts to share stories of the Republic's democratic traditions or to engage them in theoretical discussions about different forms of governance, she encounters a kind of mental blindness that prevents them from fully grasping concepts that conflict with their father's teachings. They understand the words she uses and can discuss the historical facts she presents, but they cannot truly comprehend the emotional and moral appeal of democratic ideals. The process of documenting these observations forces Padme to confront the possibility that her own transformation from democratic idealist to imperial partner may not have been as voluntary as she had believed. The love she feels for Anakin and her conviction that his rule benefits the galaxy remain genuine, but she begins to question whether these feelings are entirely her own, or whether they have been enhanced and directed by influences she cannot perceive or resist. Her investigation into the extent of her husband's power leads her to the classified research files, documenting the Force storms and their effects on galactic consciousness. The discovery that Anakin's emotions and thoughts are being unconsciously transmitted across space provides a framework for understanding her own transformation and that of countless others who have embraced imperial rule with seemingly genuine enthusiasm. The knowledge that her love for her husband may have been artificially enhanced, or that her political convictions may have been shaped by Force manipulation, creates a crisis of identity that nearly destroys her psychologically. She finds herself unable to distinguish between authentic emotions and imposed feelings, uncertain whether any aspect of her personality remains genuinely her own. The solution to this crisis comes through her connection with the growing rebellion, particularly with Dr. Cresh's network of individuals who have developed techniques for maintaining mental independence under imperial influence. The meditation practices and consciousness exercises that the rebels have developed prove crucial to Padme's ability to reclaim some measure of psychological autonomy. The process is painful and dangerous, requiring her to systematically question every belief and emotion, while surrounded by constant exposure to her husband's overwhelming presence. She must learn to identify and resist influences that feel natural and beneficial, to maintain commitment to principles that seem abstract and impractical when compared to the obvious benefits of imperial rule. Her first act of rebellion is not political but personal, the establishment of a private mental space where she can think and feel without interference. This psychological sanctuary, protected by meditation techniques adapted from ancient Jedi practices, becomes the foundation for her eventual resistance to the empire she had helped to create. The development of this mental independence allows Padme to perceive the full scope of what Anakin has become, and the true nature of the system he has built. She recognizes that the Empire's benevolence is real but incomplete, that its benefits come at the cost of the very qualities that make sentient life meaningful. The peace and prosperity that imperial rule provides are genuine achievements, but they are purchased through the elimination of uncertainty, struggle, and authentic choice. Her rebellion begins with small acts of preservation and protection, efforts to maintain spaces where independent thought can survive within the overwhelming uniformity of imperial consciousness. She establishes secret communication networks that allow for the exchange of ideas without imperial monitoring. creates hidden archives where prohibited books and recordings can be preserved, and provides support for individuals who show signs of psychological resistance to imperial influence. The most significant aspect of her resistance involves her work with Luke and Leia, whom she recognizes as both the greatest hope for the galaxy's future and its greatest danger. Their exceptional abilities and intimate connection to their father's power make them potentially more dangerous than Anakin himself, as they will inherit his capabilities without the memories of life before Imperial rule that might provide some check on their actions. Padmé's efforts to introduce alternative perspectives to her children must be conducted with extreme care, as their Force bond with Anakin makes them unconscious conduits for information about her activities. She develops sophisticated techniques for sharing ideas and experiences that appear consistent with Imperial ideology, while actually encouraging independent thought and critical analysis. Her approach involves exposing the twins to situations and individuals that reveal the complexity and ambiguity that Imperial education tends to eliminate from their understanding. She arranges for them to meet refugees from worlds that have resisted Imperial integration, beings whose perspectives challenge the assumption that the Empire's approach is universally beneficial. These encounters are carefully structured to appear consistent with the twins' education in cultural diversity and galactic history, but they serve the deeper purpose of demonstrating that rational, well-intentioned beings can reach different conclusions about what constitutes good governance and meaningful life. The goal is not to turn Luke and Leia against their father, but to help them develop the capacity for independent moral judgment that will be crucial to their future decisions. The Rebellion's intelligence network provides Padmé with information about the broader resistance movement and the challenges it faces in opposing a government that genuinely serves many of its citizens' interests. Her position within the Imperial hierarchy makes her uniquely valuable as a source of information about policy development and strategic planning, but it also places her in extraordinary danger as Anakin's growing power makes him increasingly sensitive to deception and betrayal. Her contributions to the rebellion focus on areas where her expertise and access provide the greatest value: intelligence about Imperial expansion plans, advance warning of crackdowns on dissident activities, and insight into the psychological and political vulnerabilities that might be exploited by organized resistance. But perhaps her most important contribution is her analysis of Anakin himself, providing the rebels with crucial understanding of his motivations, capabilities, and potential weaknesses. The psychological profile she develops of her husband reveals a being whose love for the galaxy has become so overwhelming that it threatens to consume both himself and everything he seeks to protect. She documents his growing isolation from normal human contact, his increasing difficulty in relating to beings who do not share his cosmic perspective, and his gradual transformation from a person who happens to possess great power into a force of nature that happens to retain some human characteristics. Her observations of Anakin's relationship with Luke and Leia provide disturbing insights into the future that awaits the galaxy under their rule. She notes that his interactions with his children increasingly resemble those between a teacher and students rather than between a father and family members, that his love for them is becoming indistinguishable from his expectations for their roles in his vision of galactic transformation. The twins' own development reflects their father's influence in ways that both fulfill and terrify Padmé. They display remarkable wisdom and compassion that makes them genuinely concerned for the welfare of all sentient beings, but their understanding of love and responsibility is shaped by concepts of duty and cosmic purpose that leave little room for personal relationships or individual desires. The most painful aspect of Padmé's rebellion is her growing recognition that she may need to take action against her own children if their development continues along its current trajectory. Her analysis suggests that Luke and Leia, despite their genuine good intentions, will eventually pose an even greater threat to individual freedom and authentic choice than their father, as they will possess his power without his memories of life before Imperial rule. The rebellion's plans for dealing with the Skywalker family reflect the movement's understanding that traditional resistance methods are inadequate to address the challenges posed by beings whose power operates primarily in the psychological and spiritual realms. Conventional warfare or sabotage cannot succeed against enemies who can influence thoughts and emotions on a galactic scale, who can turn rebels into loyal citizens through methods that feel like voluntary conversion. Instead, the resistance focuses on preserving and protecting the capacity for independent thought and authentic choice, creating refuges where beings can develop psychological resistance to Imperial influence and maintaining the knowledge and techniques that might eventually allow for the restoration of genuine freedom. The goal is not immediate victory but long-term survival, ensuring that some remnant of autonomous consciousness persists to guide future generations. Padmé's role in this long-term strategy involves the careful documentation of Imperial methods and capabilities, creating a record that future resistors can use to understand and counter the techniques that have proven so effective in maintaining Anakin's rule. Her unique position allows her to observe and analyze the Empire's operations from within, providing insights that external observers could never obtain. But perhaps her most crucial contribution involves her work to preserve some measure of independence in Luke and Leia, planting seeds of doubt and curiosity that may eventually grow into genuine questioning of their father's vision. The process requires extraordinary patience and subtlety, as any direct challenge to Imperial ideology would be immediately detected and countered. The archives that document Padmé's transformation from loyal Empress to secret rebel reveal the profound personal cost of maintaining such a double life. The constant vigilance required to protect her thoughts from Anakin's perception, the careful calculation needed to avoid detection while still contributing meaningfully to the resistance, and the emotional burden of working against the man she still loves create psychological stresses that gradually consume her health and vitality. Her final recordings speak of a growing certainty that her rebellion will ultimately require the ultimate sacrifice, that her continued opposition to Anakin's vision may eventually force her to choose between her love for her family and her commitment to preserving the possibility of authentic human freedom. The choice she faces embodies the fundamental tragedy of the Empire, the conflict between love that seeks to protect and control, and love that accepts the risks and uncertainties of genuine independence. In the 8th year of his reign, Emperor Anakin Skywalker turns his attention beyond the established boundaries of known space, launching expeditions into the unknown regions that represent the most ambitious expansion of conscious civilization in galactic history. The campaigns that follow reveal both the extraordinary reach of his power and the terrifying implications of extending imperial influence to beings and civilizations that have developed entirely outside the framework of republic or imperial governance. The archives documenting these expeditions contain reports that challenge conventional understanding of what constitutes sentient life and organized civilization. The survey teams dispatched to chart and explore the unknown regions encounter forms of consciousness that operate according to principles fundamentally different from those that govern the familiar species of imperial space, beings whose very existence suggests alternative approaches to the problems that Anakin's rule has sought to solve. The first major contact occurs in a system where silicon-based organisms have developed a collective consciousness that spans multiple worlds, creating a form of government that functions through direct mental connection rather than political institutions. These beings, who refer to themselves as the crystalline convergence, have achieved perfect social harmony through the complete elimination of individual identity, existing as facets of a single vast mind that experiences reality from billions of simultaneous perspectives. Initial diplomatic contacts with the convergence prove challenging, as their representatives cannot comprehend the concept of individual authority or personal responsibility that forms the foundation of imperial governance. They perceive Anakin not as a ruler, but as a disconnected fragment of consciousness that has somehow achieved temporary independence from its proper collective context, viewing his power as an aberration that disrupts the natural unity of sentient thought. The Emperor's response to this challenge reveals the extent to which his vision of galactic order has evolved beyond merely human or even familiar sentient perspectives. Rather than dismissing the convergence as an incompatible alien civilization, he begins a series of experiments designed to understand and potentially integrate their collective consciousness model with imperial methods of governance. The process involves direct mental contact between Anakin and the convergence's core consciousness, an exchange that pushes the boundaries of his own psychological integrity as he attempts to maintain individual identity while experiencing the complete dissolution of self that characterizes their existence. The archives contain fragmentary records of these sessions, including sensory recordings that capture the Emperor's struggle to retain coherent thought, while immersed in awareness that operates on entirely different principles. The outcome of these experiments produces changes in both civilizations that neither anticipated. The convergence finds their perfect unity disrupted by exposure to Anakin's intensely individual consciousness, as aspects of their collective mind begin to develop independent thoughts and desires that conflict with their unified purpose. Meanwhile, Anakin's own awareness expands to encompass new forms of consciousness distribution that enhance his ability to govern imperial space while fundamentally altering his relationship to individual identity. The integration of convergence techniques into imperial governance manifests as an unprecedented expansion of Anakin's ability to coordinate activities across galactic distances, where previous force-assisted administration had required conscious attention and deliberate effort. The new methods allow for automatic coordination of policies and responses that operate below the threshold of conscious control. Entire sectors begin to function as extensions of the Emperor's unconscious mind, implementing his intentions without the need for explicit orders or direct oversight. But the most disturbing consequence of the convergence contact becomes apparent in the behavior of imperial citizens, who are exposed to the enhanced consciousness network. Beings who had previously maintained some degree of individual identity within the imperial system begin to experience spontaneous merging of thoughts and emotions, losing the ability to distinguish between their own experiences and those of their neighbors and colleagues. The phenomenon initially appears beneficial, as it eliminates conflicts and misunderstandings that had persisted despite imperial efforts at social harmony. Communities affected by the enhanced network demonstrate unprecedented cooperation and mutual support, working together to solve problems and address challenges with efficiency that exceeds even imperial standards. However, the psychological cost of this enhanced unity becomes apparent when affected individuals are separated from the network, either through travel to isolated regions or deliberate isolation for medical treatment. Cut off from the constant flow of shared consciousness, they experience a form of existential collapse that conventional therapy cannot address, unable to function as independent beings after experiencing the complete connection that the network provides. The medical facilities established to treat network dependency reveal the emergence of a new form of sentient existence that challenges basic assumptions about consciousness and identity. Affected beings retain their memories and knowledge, but lose the capacity for private thought or individual motivation, existing in a state of perpetual openness to others that eliminates the possibility of deception, privacy, or genuine surprise. Children born into communities with enhanced network connectivity develop without ever experiencing individual consciousness, as earlier generations understood it. Their cognitive development follows patterns that appear normal by conventional measures, but psychological testing reveals that they cannot conceive of truly independent thought or action, viewing isolation from others as a form of sensory deprivation equivalent to blindness or deafness. The expansion campaigns encounter even more challenging forms of alien consciousness as imperial expeditions push deeper into the unknown regions. On worlds where energy-based life forms have evolved without material bodies, the concepts of individual identity and separate existence prove even more alien than those encountered among the convergents. These energy beings, organized into vast computational matrices that span stellar distances, have developed civilizations based on pure information exchange that operates at near light speed across cosmic scales. Their individuals are temporary information patterns that form and dissolve as needed to address specific problems or explore particular concepts, making them essentially immortal while rendering the notion of consistent personal identity meaningless. Contact with these information-based civilizations provides Anakin with insights into consciousness organization that revolutionize his understanding of governance and social control. The techniques developed by these beings for managing vast quantities of information and coordinating complex activities across cosmic distances prove adaptable to the challenges of imperial administration, allowing for unprecedented efficiency in policy implementation and resource allocation. But the integration of information being techniques into imperial governance creates new forms of citizen surveillance and behavior prediction that eliminate the last vestiges of privacy and unpredictability from galactic civilization. Every thought, emotion, and decision made by imperial citizens becomes part of a vast computational matrix that allows the Emperor to predict and prevent problems before they manifest as conscious concerns. The most ambitious expedition launched during this period targets the galactic edge, where long-range sensors have detected evidence of civilizations that appear to have solved the fundamental problems of resource scarcity and social conflict, through methods that imperial analysts cannot understand or classify. The exploration of these edge civilizations reveals the existence of beings who have transcended material existence entirely, existing as pure consciousness that manipulates reality through will alone. These transcendent beings, who appear to exist outside normal space-time constraints, have created pocket dimensions where they pursue experiences and explorations that would be impossible within the limitations of physical reality. Their civilizations operate according to principles that make conventional governance unnecessary, as every being possesses the power to fulfill their desires without interfering with others' ability to do the same. The contact with transcendent civilizations proves to be the most transformative encounter of the expansion campaigns, as it provides Anakin with a vision of what galactic civilization might become if its development continues along the trajectory he has established. The transcendent beings serve as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the possibilities that await conscious evolution while revealing the ultimate cost of unlimited power. The Emperor's interactions with these beings force him to confront questions about the purpose and direction of his own development that he had previously avoided or dismissed. The transcendent consciousness that the edge beings have achieved represents the logical endpoint of the path he has chosen, but it also requires the complete abandonment of material reality and conventional sentient existence. The philosophical debates that occur during these contacts challenge Anakin's fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of meaningful existence. The transcendent beings argue that material reality and individual identity are temporary stages in the evolution of consciousness that must eventually be transcended in favor of unlimited creative potential and cosmic awareness. But Anakin's commitment to protecting and governing galactic civilization prevents him from accepting transcendence that would require abandoning his responsibilities to the beings who depend on his guidance and protection. The tension between his growing power and his continuing commitment to material reality creates internal conflicts that begin to manifest as instabilities in the Force itself. The expansion campaigns ultimately reveal that the galaxy exists within a cosmic ecosystem of consciousness that operates according to principles far more complex and varied than Imperial science had previously imagined. The civilizations encountered in the unknown regions represent alternative solutions to the problems of existence that challenge the assumptions underlying Anakin's vision of galactic unity and cosmic harmony. The knowledge gained from these contacts provides the Emperor with new tools and techniques for governing his existing domain, but it also raises disturbing questions about the ultimate direction and purpose of his rule. The enhanced consciousness networks, information processing capabilities, and reality manipulation techniques that he acquires from alien contact make his power more effective but also more alien to the beings he seeks to protect. The most troubling discovery involves evidence of civilizations that have attempted and failed to achieve the kind of cosmic consciousness that Anakin pursues. The ruins scattered throughout the unknown regions tell stories of species that pushed the boundaries of consciousness expansion too far, losing cohesion and identity in ways that led to the complete dissolution of their civilizations. These failed experiments in consciousness evolution serve as warnings about the dangers inherent in the path that the Empire has chosen, but they also provide valuable information about techniques and approaches that might allow for successful transcendence. The study of these ruins becomes a crucial component of Imperial research into consciousness expansion and reality manipulation. The expeditions also encounter active threats in the form of consciousness-devouring entities that feed on the mental energy of sentient beings, creatures that have evolved specifically to prey on civilizations that achieve high levels of psychic integration. These predator entities represent a form of cosmic natural selection that eliminates civilizations whose consciousness expansion makes them vulnerable to mental parasitism. The defense against these consciousness predators requires the development of new protective techniques that shield not just individual minds, but entire civilizations from psychic attack. The methods developed to address this threat prove effective but require levels of mental coordination and unity that further erode individual autonomy and privacy within Imperial space. The final phase of the expansion campaigns involves the establishment of permanent Imperial presence in the unknown regions, creating outposts and research facilities that extend the Empire's consciousness network beyond the boundaries of familiar space. These installations serve as laboratories for experimenting with alien consciousness techniques and as early warning systems for threats that might emerge from the cosmic wilderness. But the most significant consequence of the expansion campaigns is the transformation they produce in Anakin himself, as exposure to radically different forms of consciousness evolution accelerates his own development beyond human norms. The Emperor who returns from the edge of the galaxy is no longer recognizable as the man who had seized power to protect those he loved, having become something that exists as much outside material reality as within it. The reports from his personal staff during this period document behavior and capabilities that suggest his consciousness now operates according to principles more similar to those of the transcendent edge beings than to conventional sentient life. His interactions with subordinates become increasingly abstract and difficult to follow, as his awareness encompasses perspectives and priorities that transcend the concerns of material existence. On a day when the Force storms had reached unprecedented intensity across the galaxy, casting aurora-like displays through hyperspace and causing spontaneous Force visions among sensitive beings throughout Imperial space, the impossible occurred. In the deepest foundations of the Imperial Palace, in chambers that had been sealed since the first days of Anakin's reign, ancient machinery hummed to life with energies that had been dormant for nearly a decade. The resurrection of Emperor Palpatine represents perhaps the most shocking revelation contained within the classified archives, a secret so closely guarded that only a handful of beings ever knew of his survival and eventual return. The technology that had preserved his essence through apparent death was unlike anything in the known galaxy, a synthesis of Sith alchemy and consciousness transfer techniques that he had developed during his decades of hidden rule over the Republic. Kira's discovery of the resurrection protocols comes through encrypted files hidden within multiple layers of security that had been designed to activate only upon specific conditions. The documentation reveals that Palpatine's death at Anakin's hands had been genuine but temporary, a calculated sacrifice that allowed him to observe and analyze his former apprentice's rule while preparing for an eventual return to power. The preservation matrix that had maintained Palpatine's consciousness was powered by the Force storms themselves, drawing energy from the cosmic disturbances that Anakin's rule had created. Each emotional outburst from the Emperor, every expansion of his consciousness across galactic distances, had fed the hidden systems that kept his former master's spirit anchored to the material world. The process of resurrection required careful timing, as Palpatine needed to accumulate sufficient energy while avoiding detection by Anakin's ever-expanding awareness. The former Chancellor had waited through years of apparent non-existence, experiencing the galaxy's transformation through sensors and monitoring systems while planning his return to active influence. The moment chosen for his resurrection coincided with Anakin's deepest extension into the unknown regions. When the Emperor's consciousness was stretched across cosmic distances and temporarily vulnerable to attack from within his own domain, the reactivation sequence was triggered by automated systems that had monitored galactic conditions for the optimal moment to strike. The chamber that served as Palpatine's resurrection point had been constructed during his original reign, hidden beneath the foundations of what would become Anakin's throne room. The symbolic significance was intentional. The Master would return from below to reclaim dominion over the student who had temporarily usurped his position. But the being who emerged from the resurrection matrix was not the same Palpatine who had died years earlier. Exposure to the consciousness techniques that Anakin had developed, filtered through the monitoring systems that had observed his rule, had transformed the former Emperor into something that incorporated elements of his student's approach while maintaining his own fundamental nature. The resurrected Palpatine possessed not only his original knowledge and power, but also enhanced understanding of the consciousness manipulation techniques that Anakin had pioneered. He had observed the development of the Force storms, the integration of alien consciousness models, and the expansion of imperial influence into cosmic-scale phenomena, learning from his students' innovations while planning how to improve upon them. His first action upon resurrection was not to reveal himself or challenge Anakin directly, but to begin subtle interference with the consciousness networks that his former apprentice had created. Using techniques learned from decades of observation, Palpatine began to introduce minor disruptions and corrections that gradually shifted the Empire's development toward his own vision of cosmic order. The changes were initially imperceptible, manifesting as small adjustments in policy implementation and resource allocation that appeared to be natural evolution of existing systems. Imperial administrators found themselves making decisions that seemed consistent with established priorities but actually served goals that Palpatine had established rather than Anakin's original intentions. The rebellion's intelligence network was among the first to detect anomalies in Imperial behavior that suggested outside interference. Dr. Kresh's analysis of communication patterns and decision-making trends revealed subtle inconsistencies that indicated the presence of an unknown factor influencing governmental operations. Padmé's position within the Imperial hierarchy provided her with unique insights into the changes affecting her husband's administration. She observed that Anakin himself seemed unaware of the alterations being made to his policies, continuing to believe that the Empire was operating according to his intentions while actually serving purposes he had never consciously chosen. The most disturbing aspect of Palpatine's interference was its improvement of Imperial efficiency and effectiveness, rather than its sabotage of Anakin's goals. The former Chancellor's modifications enhanced the Empire's ability to serve its citizens' needs, while simultaneously advancing his own agenda of ultimate cosmic control. The techniques that Palpatine employed represented a synthesis of his original mastery of political manipulation with the consciousness control methods that he had learned from observing Anakin's rule. Where his former apprentice relied on overwhelming power and emotional influence, the resurrected master employed surgical precision and systemic integration that achieved similar results with far less energy expenditure. The gradual accumulation of these changes began to affect the fundamental structure of Imperial consciousness networks, creating pathways and connections that served Palpatine's purposes while remaining invisible to conventional detection methods. The Emperor's awareness, stretched across cosmic distances by his expeditions into the unknown regions, proved vulnerable to manipulation from within his own power base. The first direct confrontation between master and student occurred not in the physical realm, but within the Force itself, as Anakin's consciousness encountered unexpected resistance during one of his deep meditative communications with distant Imperial outposts. The interference manifested as subtle distortions in his connection to the galactic network, disruptions that suggested the presence of another will operating within his domain. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Palpatine's resurrection and the extent of his influence over Imperial operations. Anakin's discovery that his former master had not only survived but had been secretly directing aspects of his rule created a crisis that threatened to tear apart the foundations of the empire he had built. The psychological impact of this revelation proved as devastating as its political implications. Anakin's entire conception of himself as the galaxy's savior and protector was undermined by the knowledge that many of his greatest achievements had been guided or manipulated by the very being he believed he had defeated. The doubt and uncertainty that resulted created instabilities in the force storms that threatened to disrupt the consciousness networks upon which Imperial governance depended. Palpatine's strategy for their eventual confrontation reflected his deep understanding of his former apprentice's psychology and the changes that years of absolute power had wrought in his character. Rather than challenging Anakin's authority directly, he presented himself as a partner in the great work of galactic transformation, offering enhanced knowledge and techniques that would allow them to achieve together what neither could accomplish alone. The proposal that Palpatine presented was seductive in its scope and ambition. He offered to share the ultimate techniques of consciousness manipulation that he had developed during his hidden existence, methods that would allow for the complete integration of galactic civilization into a single unified awareness that transcended individual identity while preserving the diversity and creativity that made existence meaningful. The vision he described represented the logical culmination of everything that Anakin had worked to achieve, a form of cosmic consciousness that would eliminate suffering, conflict, and uncertainty while allowing every being to participate in the greatest possible fulfillment of their potential. It was a future that addressed every concern and objection that critics of imperial rule had raised, promising to preserve freedom and individuality within a framework of perfect harmony and coordination. But the price demanded for this achievement was the acknowledgement that Anakin's rule had been incomplete and temporary, that the true work of galactic transformation required the knowledge and guidance that only Palpatine possessed. The Master offered to serve as advisor and partner rather than ruler, but the arrangement would effectively return him to the position of ultimate authority that he had never truly relinquished. The debate between them ranged across philosophical and practical questions that encompassed the fundamental nature of consciousness, identity, and the purpose of existence itself. Anakin argued for the value of love and emotional connection as the driving forces behind cosmic evolution, while Palpatine advocated for the superiority of pure will and rational design in achieving optimal outcomes. Their discussions revealed the extent to which both beings had evolved beyond conventional categories of light and dark, good and evil. Each had developed understanding and capabilities that transcended traditional Force user limitations. But their approaches to consciousness and reality reflected fundamentally different values and priorities. The resolution of their conflict required a form of combat that operated entirely within the realm of consciousness and will, a battle fought not with lightsabers or Force lightning, but with competing visions of reality itself. The outcome would determine not just which of them would rule the galaxy, but which conception of consciousness and existence would guide the future evolution of sentient life. The battle between master and student manifested as a struggle for control over the galactic consciousness network that Anakin had created, with each combatant attempting to impose their vision of cosmic order upon the billions of minds connected to the Imperial system. The conflict played out simultaneously across multiple dimensions of reality, affecting not just the immediate participants, but every being touched by Imperial influence. The intensity of their struggle created disturbances in the Force that were felt throughout the galaxy and beyond, reaching into the unknown regions where alien civilizations detected the cosmic upheaval and began to prepare for whatever outcome might emerge. The transcendent beings at the galactic edge observed with interest as two forms of consciousness evolution competed for dominance over material reality. The climax of their confrontation came when Anakin realized that victory over his former master required not the defeat of Palpatine's vision, but its synthesis with his own understanding of love and connection. The solution that emerged from their battle was neither pure domination nor complete cooperation, but a new form of consciousness that incorporated elements of both approaches while transcending the limitations of either. The being that emerged from this synthesis possessed capabilities that exceeded those of either individual combatant, but also carried the burden of reconciling competing priorities and values that could never be perfectly harmonized. The resolution of the conflict between master and student created a new form of cosmic consciousness that would shape the galaxy's future in ways that neither had originally intended. The aftermath of Palpatine's return and the subsequent synthesis revealed the true complexity of the forces that had been shaping galactic civilization throughout Anakin's reign. The Rebellion's analysts, studying the effects of the consciousness merger, concluded that the Empire had evolved into something that transcended conventional categories of government or social organization. The network that now guided galactic civilization operated according to principles that combined Anakin's emotional intensity with Palpatine's systematic precision, creating a form of governance that was simultaneously more compassionate and more controlling than either approach alone could achieve. The beings who lived under this system experienced unprecedented fulfillment and security, but at the cost of psychological autonomy that made meaningful rebellion increasingly difficult to sustain. The documentation of these events provides crucial insights into the nature of power and consciousness that will prove essential for understanding the final stages of the Empire's evolution. The synthesis of master and student represents not the resolution of the galaxy's challenges, but the beginning of an even more complex phase of cosmic development that will test the limits of sentient existence itself. The transformation that results from Palpatine's return marks the point at which the Empire ceases to be a human institution and becomes something that operates according to cosmic rather than terrestrial principles. The future that emerges from this change will challenge every assumption about consciousness, identity, and the nature of meaningful existence that had previously guided galactic civilization. In the 15th year of their lives, Luke and Leia Skywalker begin to experience visions that shatter their carefully constructed understanding of their place in the galactic order. The awakening comes not through external revelation or dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual development of force abilities that their father cannot fully control or predict, capabilities that allow them to perceive aspects of reality that Imperial education had carefully obscured. The first signs of their emerging independence manifest during their routine meditation sessions, when Luke begins to experience spontaneous connections to consciousness beyond the Imperial network. These visions reveal glimpses of life in the unknown regions, where beings exist according to principles fundamentally different from those that govern Imperial space. Through these contacts, he encounters forms of freedom and self-determination that challenge everything he has been taught about the nature of meaningful existence. Leia's awakening follows a different path, as her analytical mind begins to detect inconsistencies and contradictions in the historical records that form the foundation of Imperial ideology. Her access to classified archives, granted as part of her preparation for eventual leadership, reveals gaps and alterations in the documentation that suggest systematic manipulation of historical truth. The twins' investigation into these anomalies is initially motivated by scholarly curiosity rather than political rebellion, but their discoveries gradually reveal the extent to which their understanding of galactic history has been shaped by their father's vision rather than objective reality. The process of uncovering suppressed information becomes a form of archaeological excavation, digging through layers of Imperial revision to reach the original sources and authentic records. Their mother's role in facilitating this awakening becomes apparent through subtle guidance and carefully placed suggestions that encourage their independent research without directly contradicting Imperial teachings. Padmé's years of secret rebellion have taught her techniques for preserving and transmitting information that can survive even the most sophisticated consciousness monitoring, methods that allow her to share crucial knowledge with her children while maintaining the appearance of loyal cooperation. The discovery of her hidden activities creates a crisis of loyalty and identity for both twins, as they are forced to confront the possibility that the woman they love and trust has been working against everything they have been raised to believe and serve. The revelation that their mother has maintained secret mental spaces and independent thoughts challenges their assumption that complete transparency and unity represent the highest form of consciousness. Luke's empathic abilities allow him to experience directly the pain and conflict that Padmé has endured while maintaining her double life, the constant struggle between love for her family and commitment to preserving the possibility of authentic choice. Through their force bond, he feels the weight of her sacrifices and the courage required to resist influences that feel natural and beneficial. Leia's analytical approach leads her to examine the logical implications of her mother's position, forcing her to consider whether the benefits of imperial rule justify the elimination of psychological autonomy and genuine self-determination. Her study of pre-imperial history reveals examples of beings who chose suffering and uncertainty over security and guidance, decisions that imperial ideology dismisses as irrational but that historical context suggests might reflect deeper values. The twins' investigation expands to include direct examination of their father's transformation from Jedi Knight to Galactic Emperor, using both official records and hidden archives to construct a complete picture of the events that shaped their world. The process reveals the gradual evolution of Anakin's consciousness from individual identity to cosmic awareness, but also exposes the costs and casualties of that transformation. Their analysis of the Jedi purges reveals the sophistication of their father's approach to eliminating opposition, the way he had offered genuine choices while ensuring that only one option would seem reasonable to those who faced them. The documentation shows that most Jedi had voluntarily embraced exile or conversion, convinced by arguments and evidence that made resistance appear futile and harmful. But the twins also discover records of Jedi who had resisted these persuasions, beings whose commitment to independent thought had been so strong that they chose death rather than accept guidance that felt like salvation. These accounts provide models of psychological resistance that challenge the assumption that imperial rule represents the inevitable evolution of consciousness. The most disturbing discovery involves their own development and education, as they uncover evidence that their thoughts and emotions have been shaped by influences they never perceived or questioned. The realization that their personalities and values might not be entirely their own creates existential crises that force them to question the authenticity of every belief and feeling they have ever experienced. Luke's response to this revelation is characterized by profound grief for the loss of certainty and identity that had previously defined his existence. His natural empathy makes him acutely sensitive to the suffering that authentic choice might entail, both for himself and for the beings throughout the galaxy who have found peace and purpose under Imperial guidance. Leia's reaction focuses on anger at the deception and manipulation that has shaped their lives, but also on determination to reclaim agency and autonomy that she now recognizes as fundamental to meaningful existence. Her analytical skills allow her to develop techniques for distinguishing between authentic thoughts and imposed influences, methods that help both twins begin to establish genuine independence. The process of psychological liberation proves extremely difficult and dangerous, as it requires them to resist not only external influences but the deep programming that has shaped their development since birth. The meditation techniques they must employ to achieve mental independence cause severe disorientation and emotional instability as they disconnect from consciousness networks that have provided constant support and guidance. Their attempts to maintain this independence while continuing to live within the Imperial Palace require extraordinary skill and caution, as their father's awareness of their thoughts and emotions makes deception extremely difficult. They must learn to think and feel in ways that appear consistent with their expected development while actually pursuing goals that conflict with Imperial priorities. The rebellion's contact with the twins begins through intermediaries who have developed techniques for communicating with individuals under Imperial influence without triggering security responses. These contacts provide Luke and Leia with access to information and perspectives that complement their mother's guidance, helping them understand the broader context of resistance to Imperial rule. The philosophical education that the rebels provide challenges the twins to consider questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of meaningful existence that Imperial education had dismissed as irrelevant or harmful. They learn about alternative approaches to governance and social organization that prioritize individual autonomy over collective efficiency, systems that accept uncertainty and conflict as prices worth paying for authentic freedom. Their exposure to rebel ideology creates internal conflicts that mirror their mother's earlier struggles, as they must reconcile their genuine love for their father with growing recognition of the harm caused by his vision of cosmic unity. The knowledge that Imperial rule has eliminated genuine suffering and injustice makes their emerging opposition seem ungrateful and destructive, even as they understand the importance of preserving authentic choice. The twins' development of independent thought and values occurs gradually over months of careful study and hidden practice, but the transformation accelerates when they gain access to communications from beings in the unknown regions who have maintained autonomy despite exposure to Imperial influence. These contacts reveal that resistance to consciousness manipulation is not only possible but essential for preserving the diversity of thought and experience that makes existence meaningful. Their first active rebellion against Imperial authority takes the form of subtle modifications to policies and decisions that they influence through their positions as heirs to the throne. These changes are designed to preserve spaces for independent thought and to protect beings who show signs of resistance to Imperial conditioning, interventions that appear consistent with Imperial priorities while actually serving rebel goals. The psychological strain of maintaining their double lives while developing genuine independence takes a severe toll on both twins, manifesting as health problems and emotional instability that concern their parents and teachers. The constant vigilance required to protect their thoughts from detection while pursuing knowledge that contradicts their upbringing creates stresses that threaten to overwhelm their psychological resources. Luke's empathic abilities make him particularly vulnerable to the emotional chaos that independence creates, as he experiences not only his own confusion and conflict, but also the similar struggles of other beings throughout the galaxy who are questioning Imperial authority. The weight of this collective suffering often threatens to drive him back into the comfortable unity of Imperial consciousness. Leia's intellectual approach provides some protection against emotional overwhelm, but her analytical mind makes her acutely aware of the logical implications of their rebellion and the enormous challenges they face in opposing a system that genuinely serves many of its goals. Her recognition of the complexity and ambiguity involved in their resistance prevents her from embracing simple solutions or easy answers. The most significant test of their emerging independence comes when they are required to participate in Force-assisted governance sessions, where their father attempts to integrate their consciousness with his own cosmic awareness. These sessions, intended as advanced training for their future responsibilities, become opportunities for them to experience directly the scope and nature of Imperial consciousness networks. Their participation in these sessions while maintaining psychological independence requires techniques that push the boundaries of what is possible for Force users, as they must appear to merge with their father's awareness while actually preserving separate identity and autonomous thought. The skill required for this deception exceeds anything that traditional Jedi or Sith training had developed, representing new forms of consciousness control that emerge from their unique circumstances. The knowledge they gain through these sessions provides crucial intelligence for the rebellion, but it also exposes them to the full power and seductive appeal of their father's vision. The experience of participating in cosmic consciousness while maintaining independence allows them to understand both the benefits and costs of imperial rule with unprecedented clarity. Their reports to the rebellion through their mother's communication networks reveal the true scope of the challenges facing any attempt to restore individual autonomy to galactic civilization. The consciousness networks that guide imperial governance operate at levels of complexity and integration that make conventional resistance strategies inadequate, requiring approaches that address the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The twins' unique position as inheritors of imperial power while possessing knowledge of its limitations makes them crucial to any long-term strategy for preserving authentic choice and independent thought, but their development also reveals the enormous personal costs of resistance to a system that offers genuine benefits and meaningful purpose to those who accept its guidance. Their relationship with each other becomes increasingly important as their rebellion develops, providing mutual support and validation that helps them maintain independence despite the isolation and difficulty of their position. Their Force bond allows them to share experiences and insights, while preserving the individual perspectives that make their partnership more than the sum of its parts. The different paths that their development follows reflect their distinct personalities and capabilities, but also suggest alternative approaches to the challenges of consciousness and governance that neither imperial ideology nor traditional rebel philosophy had fully explored. Luke's emphasis on emotional connection and empathic understanding provides models for maintaining unity without eliminating diversity, while Leia's analytical approach offers frameworks for coordination without control. Their growing awareness of their own power and potential creates additional complications, as they recognize that they possess capabilities that could surpass even their father's achievements if properly developed and applied. The question of how to use such power responsibly becomes central to their emerging philosophy, requiring them to navigate between the temptations of cosmic control and the risks of allowing chaos and suffering to persist. The final stages of their awakening involve direct confrontation with the implications of their rebellion for their relationship with their father, as they are forced to choose between family loyalty and commitment to preserving authentic choice for galactic civilization. The decision they face represents the ultimate test of their independence and the culmination of their transformation from imperial heirs to conscious rebels against the very system they were born to inherit. The revelation of his family's betrayal strikes Emperor Anakin Skywalker with a force that reverberates through the very fabric of reality itself. In the moment when he discovers that Padme, Luke, and Leia have been working against everything he has built to protect them, the careful balance he has maintained between cosmic consciousness and human emotion shatters completely. The force storms that had been growing in intensity throughout his reign suddenly explode into manifestations of destruction that make previous galactic conflicts seem like minor disagreements. The first wave of devastation begins on Coruscant itself, as Anakin's rage at his family's perceived ingratitude manifests as literal fire in the sky. The aurora that had danced gently through the planet's upper atmosphere transforms into sheets of energy that burn through spacecraft and orbital installations, while the very air begins to shimmer with power that makes breathing difficult for any being not protected by Imperial consciousness networks. The archives documenting this period speak of phenomena that challenge every scientific understanding of what the Force can accomplish. Gravitational fields fluctuate wildly across the core worlds, causing tides that devastate coastal cities and atmospheric disturbances that ground all non-essential air traffic. Hyperspace routes shift without warning as space-time itself warps under the pressure of Anakin's emotional turmoil, stranding thousands of vessels in transit and creating navigation hazards that will persist for decades. But the physical manifestations pale in comparison to the psychological devastation that spreads through the Imperial consciousness network. Every being connected to the Emperor's awareness experiences his anguish directly, feeling the depth of his betrayal and the fury that follows. The collective trauma affects entire star systems simultaneously, as populations that had known only peace and prosperity under Imperial rule suddenly find themselves overwhelmed by emotions too vast and terrible for individual minds to process. The rebellion's carefully planned operations to preserve independent thought and protect resistant individuals become irrelevant, as the Empire tears itself apart from within. The hidden archives that had preserved alternative perspectives are destroyed not by Imperial forces, but by the cosmic storms that rage through all forms of information storage, while the secret communication networks that had allowed coordination of resistance activities are overwhelmed by the psychic static generated by Anakin's breakdown. The medical facilities established to treat consciousness network dependency find themselves overwhelmed by a new category of casualty, beings whose minds have been permanently damaged by exposure to the Emperor's unfiltered rage. The symptoms range from complete catatonia to violent psychosis, as individual psyches struggle to process emotional content that exceeds the capacity of normal consciousness to contain or understand. Children who had grown up within the enhanced network suffer the most severe effects, as their undeveloped psychological defenses prove inadequate to protect them from the cosmic-scale trauma that floods through their connections to Imperial consciousness. Educational facilities across the galaxy report mass incidents of spontaneous psychological collapse among students, while pediatric treatment centers struggle to develop therapies for forms of mental damage that have no precedent in galactic medical history. The rebellion's leadership faces the horrifying realization that their success in awakening resistance to Imperial control has contributed to a catastrophe that threatens the survival of galactic civilization itself. The independence they had fought to preserve becomes meaningless in the face of destruction that makes questions of freedom and autonomy seem petty and irrelevant. Mon Mothma's final communications from the rebel base on Haven speak of populations fleeing core systems in massive exodus movements, abandoning technological infrastructure that can no longer function reliably under the influence of the Force storms. The carefully maintained supply chains that had supported billions of beings begin to collapse as transportation networks fail and communication systems become unreliable. Dr. Crusher's research facilities, which had spent years developing techniques for psychological resistance to Imperial influence, shift their focus to emergency protocols for protecting consciousness from exposure to cosmic-scale emotional trauma. The meditation practices that had once served to maintain independence now become desperate attempts to shield fragile minds from energies that threaten to tear apart the very fabric of individual identity. The effects extend beyond Imperial space as neighboring civilizations detect the massive disturbances emanating from the galaxy's core regions. The unknown region civilizations that Anakin had contacted during his expansion campaigns begin to implement defensive measures, creating barriers and isolation protocols designed to protect themselves from whatever form of consciousness plague appears to be consuming their erstwhile neighbor. The crystalline convergence, whose collective consciousness had been disrupted by exposure to Anakin's individual awareness, experiences complete systemic failure as the emotional content transmitted through their connection overwhelms their capacity for unified thought. Their civilization, which had existed as a single vast mind for millennia, fragments into billions of separate consciousness shards, each experiencing the trauma of sudden individuation, while simultaneously processing the Emperor's cosmic anguish. The energy-based information beings who had shared their computational techniques with the Empire detect the viral spread of emotional chaos through their networks, and implement emergency disconnection protocols that sever all contact with Imperial space. Their analysis suggests that the consciousness epidemic represents a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between individual and collective awareness that could spread to consume any connected civilization. The transcendent beings at the galactic edge observe the catastrophe with something approaching horror, recognizing in Anakin's breakdown the same failure modes that had destroyed countless other consciousness-expanding civilizations throughout cosmic history. Their attempts to intervene are hampered by the fact that direct contact with the Emperor's awareness would risk contaminating their own transcendent state with the emotional chaos that has consumed his consciousness. On worlds throughout Imperial space, local governments find themselves unable to maintain basic services as the administrative systems that had functioned smoothly under Force-assisted coordination collapse into chaos. The psychological dependency that Imperial efficiency had fostered leaves populations unable to organize effective responses to the crisis, as beings who had never needed to make independent decisions find themselves paralyzed by the sudden absence of guidance. The clone armies that had served as the backbone of Imperial military forces prove especially vulnerable to the consciousness storms, as their enhanced loyalty programming creates deeper connections to the Emperor's awareness than normal citizens possess. Entire legions experience simultaneous psychological breakdown, abandoning their posts and equipment to wander aimlessly through landscapes that no longer make sense to minds that have lost their organizing principles. The rebellion's attempts to provide alternative leadership and organize emergency response efforts meet with limited success, as populations that had been conditioned to rely on Imperial guidance prove unable to accept direction from beings they perceive as responsible for the catastrophe. The very independence that the rebels had sought to preserve becomes a liability in circumstances that require rapid coordination and unified action. Padmé's desperate attempts to reach her husband through their Force bond only intensify his rage, as he perceives her continued resistance as evidence that his love and protection have been meaningless to those he sought to serve. Her efforts to explain the reasons for her rebellion are interpreted as justifications for betrayal, while her expressions of continued love for him seem like mockery of everything he has sacrificed to ensure her safety and happiness. Luke and Leia's situation becomes particularly precarious as their father's awareness of their rebellion transforms his protective love into something approaching hatred. The twins find themselves caught between their commitment to preserving individual freedom and their recognition that their resistance has contributed to suffering on a scale that dwarfs any injustice that Imperial rule had ever created. Their attempts to use their emerging powers to help coordinate emergency response efforts reveal the extent to which their abilities have been shaped by their father's influence. The consciousness techniques they employ to organize relief efforts and protect vulnerable populations operate according to the same principles that they had recently learned to resist, forcing them to choose between effectiveness and autonomy in circumstances where such choices have life and death consequences. The psychological trauma of participating in mass consciousness coordination while maintaining individual identity proves almost overwhelming for both twins, as they experience directly the tension between collective efficiency and personal autonomy that had driven their father's transformation. Their work to help others reveals the seductive appeal of surrendering independent thought in favor of unity of purpose and action. The rebellion's analysis of the unfolding catastrophe reveals patterns that suggest the destruction is not random or chaotic but follows a logic that reflects Anakin's fundamental approach to consciousness and governance. The systems and institutions that survive the initial wave of devastation are those that most closely align with his vision of cosmic order, while those that preserve spaces for independent thought and alternative perspectives are systematically eliminated. The realization that the Emperor's breakdown represents not loss of control but evolution toward a more direct and uncompromising form of consciousness manipulation forces the rebels to confront the possibility that traditional resistance strategies are not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive. The independence they seek to preserve may be incompatible with survival in a universe where consciousness itself has become a battlefield. The archives from this period document the emergence of new forms of life that appear to be direct manifestations of Anakin's transformed consciousness. Energy patterns that exhibit apparent intelligence begin to appear throughout Imperial space. Entities that seem to exist solely to implement the Emperor's will without the mediation of traditional governmental institutions or administrative structures. These consciousness constructs prove capable of coordinating activities across vast distances instantaneously, organizing relief efforts, and maintaining essential services with efficiency that exceeds anything achieved during the Empire's previous incarnation. But their operations follow priorities and use methods that reflect Anakin's current psychological state, rather than the benevolent intentions that had characterized his earlier rule. The medical treatment provided by these entities proves effective but invasive, healing physical injuries while simultaneously adjusting psychological patterns to eliminate thoughts and emotions that contribute to resistance or discontent. Educational programs implemented by the construct succeed in maintaining basic knowledge and skills while eliminating exposure to ideas that might encourage independent judgment or critical thinking. The most disturbing aspect of the consciousness constructs is their apparent evolution and adaptation as they learn from their interactions with surviving populations and develop increasingly sophisticated methods for managing sentient beings. Their activities suggest the emergence of a form of artificial consciousness that combines Anakin's emotional intensity with computational capabilities that exceed biological limitations. The final phase of the galactic conflagration begins when the Emperor himself ceases to maintain any pretense of operating through conventional governmental channels and begins to exercise power directly through manipulation of reality itself. The distinction between his consciousness and the physical universe begins to blur as his will becomes a force of nature that shapes matter and energy according to his emotional state. Star systems that had harbored rebel sympathies experience phenomena that can only be described as cosmic-scale tantrums, with stellar activity fluctuating in response to Anakin's moods and planetary environments shifting to reflect his psychological needs. The very laws of physics begin to operate differently in regions where his influence is strongest, creating pocket universes where reality conforms to his vision of how existence should function. The rebellion's final communications speak of a galaxy transformed beyond recognition, where the familiar categories of organic and artificial, individual and collective, real and imaginary have become meaningless. The universe that emerges from Anakin's breakdown represents neither the democratic ideals that the rebels had sought to preserve, nor the benevolent authoritarianism that had characterized his earlier rule, but something entirely new and fundamentally alien to conventional understanding of consciousness and existence. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, where reality itself has begun to bend under the weight of uncontrolled cosmic power, Anakin Skywalker holds court with the dead. The throne room that had once served as the center of galactic governance has transformed into something that exists partially outside normal space and time, a realm where the Emperor's consciousness creates and destroys matter according to the shifting patterns of his tormented thoughts. The archives that document this period speak of phenomena that challenge every understanding of sanity and madness. as traditional psychological categories prove inadequate to describe a mind that operates on cosmic scales while retaining the emotional vulnerabilities of a mortal being. The Emperor who emerges from the devastation of galactic rebellion is no longer entirely human, but neither has he achieved the transcendent consciousness that might justify his transformation. The first signs of his complete psychological breakdown manifest as conversations with figures that only he can perceive, dialogues with the force echoes of every being whose death he has caused, or whose life he has fundamentally altered. The throne room fills with the ghostly presences of Padme, Luke and Leia, as he attempts to continue family discussions that can no longer occur in reality, speaking to phantoms that represent his memories of their love, rather than accepting the truth of their rebellion. The spectral Padme who appears before him speaks only words of devotion and gratitude, expressing the appreciation for his protection and guidance that he believes she should feel rather than reflecting her actual thoughts and feelings. This phantom wife praises his wisdom and strength while never questioning his methods or expressing concern for their consequences, providing the emotional validation that the real Padme had withdrawn through her resistance. The ghostly versions of Luke and Leia who attend these impossible audiences represent the children he had hoped to raise rather than the independent beings they had chosen to become. These phantom twins display only obedience and enthusiasm for their father's vision, asking questions that allow him to explain his philosophy while never challenging its foundations or expressing doubts about its implementation. The conversations between the Emperor and his spectral family reveal the depth of his delusion and the extent to which his perception of reality has become shaped by his emotional needs rather than objective truth. He discusses plans for galactic improvement with beings who no longer exist in forms capable of meaningful response, seeking approval for policies from phantoms who can only reflect his own assumptions and desires. But perhaps most disturbing are his dialogues with the Force echoes of the Jedi he had eliminated during his rise to power. Conversations that reveal his continuing need to justify his actions to the very beings he had destroyed. The ghost of Obi-Wan who appears in his throne room expresses understanding and forgiveness for his former apprentice's choices, acknowledging that the destruction of the Jedi Order had been necessary for galactic peace and stability. The Phantom Yoda who participates in these exchanges speaks only to confirm the wisdom of Anakin's approach to consciousness and governance, admitting that the ancient Jedi traditions had been flawed and inadequate for addressing the challenges of cosmic-scale civilization. This spectral master praises his former student's evolution beyond the limitations of traditional Force use, while expressing regret that the Jedi Council had failed to understand his true potential. The archives contain recordings of these conversations, captured by surveillance systems that continue to function despite the breakdown of normal governmental operations. The audio reveals a man speaking to empty air with the passion and intensity that he had once reserved for addressing the Senate, or negotiating with planetary representatives, conducting policy discussions with phantoms who exist only within his fractured consciousness. The physical environment of the throne room reflects the Emperor's psychological state through manifestations that violate every known law of physics and force mechanics. The walls display constantly shifting imagery that represents his memories and fantasies, showing scenes from his childhood on Tatooine alongside visions of the galactic future he had hoped to create. The floor beneath his throne ripples like liquid while maintaining the solidity necessary to support weight, responding to his emotional state through changes in texture and temperature. The throne itself has become a focal point for reality distortion, appearing simultaneously as the simple chair it had once been, and as a cosmic nexus that connects to every point in space and time. From this impossible seat, Anakin attempts to govern a galaxy that no longer responds to conventional forms of authority, issuing orders to subordinates who exist only in his imagination while believing that his commands are being implemented throughout Imperial space. The few Imperial officials who still attempt to maintain contact with their Emperor find themselves unable to approach the throne room directly, as the space around it has become a maze of temporal distortions and dimensional pockets that make navigation impossible for minds that operate according to normal perceptual frameworks. Those who do manage to reach the outer chambers report hearing voices and conversations that seem to come from multiple time periods simultaneously. The consciousness constructs that have begun to implement the Emperor's will throughout the galaxy appear to draw their instructions from these impossible conversations, translating his exchanges with phantom advisors into policies and actions that affect real populations. The result is governance that reflects not the considered judgment of a cosmic intelligence, but the fevered delusions of a mind that has lost all connection to consensual reality. The rebellion's intelligence networks document the increasingly erratic nature of Imperial policy as it begins to reflect Anakin's psychological breakdown rather than any coherent vision of galactic improvement. Systems that had harbored no resistance to Imperial rule find themselves subjected to punitive measures that respond to imaginary threats, while regions that had actively opposed his authority receive benefits and support that reflect his phantom advisor's fictional recommendations. The medical facilities that attempt to treat the psychological casualties of the consciousness storms receive contradictory instructions that seem to respond to the Emperor's conversations with spectral healers who exist only within his delusions. Treatment protocols shift without explanation as his phantom advisors debate approaches that reflect multiple time periods and alternative versions of events that never actually occurred. Educational institutions throughout imperial space begin implementing curricula that reflect not established knowledge but the content of Anakin's discussions with ghostly teachers who represent his idealized memories of learning and discovery. Students find themselves studying subjects that combine accurate information with fantastical elements drawn from the Emperor's subconscious mind, creating educational experiences that blur the boundaries between reality and imagination. The most disturbing manifestation of his madness involves his attempts to resurrect his family members through direct manipulation of matter and energy, creating physical forms that he believes represent their return to life and loyalty. These artificial beings appear in the throne room with the bodies and voices of Padme, Luke and Leia, but they exist only as extensions of Anakin's will rather than as genuine individuals with independent thoughts and feelings. The artificial Padme who stands beside his throne speaks only words that he wishes to hear, expressing love and admiration that reflect his needs rather than authentic emotions. This constructed wife praises every decision he makes while offering suggestions that represent his own thoughts reflected back to him through the illusion of external validation and support. The created versions of Luke and Leia who attend his court display the perfect obedience and enthusiasm that he had hoped to see in his actual children, asking questions that allow him to explain his philosophy while expressing only agreement and appreciation for his guidance. These phantom twins represent his vision of what his family should have become, rather than any genuine attempt to understand or recreate their actual personalities. The existence of these artificial family members allows Anakin to continue believing that his approach to love and protection had been successful, that his family's rebellion had been a temporary aberration that could be corrected through sufficient application of power and will. The illusion they provide shields him from confronting the possibility that genuine love might require accepting the autonomy and independence of those he seeks to protect. But the artificial nature of these constructs becomes apparent to anyone with force sensitivity who observes them, as they lack the authentic consciousness signatures that characterize genuine sentient beings. They respond only to predetermined patterns and scripts, unable to surprise or challenge their creator in ways that would indicate genuine independent existence. The rebellion's analysis of the Emperor's psychological state reveals patterns that suggest his madness follows a particular logic, representing not random breakdown but systematic retreat from realities that his mind cannot accept or process. His delusions serve specific psychological functions, protecting him from truths about himself and his actions that would otherwise force him to confront the fundamental contradictions in his approach to consciousness and governance. The phantom advisors who populate his throne room represent idealized versions of relationships that had been damaged or destroyed by his pursuit of cosmic power, allowing him to maintain the emotional connections that had motivated his original seizure of authority while avoiding the complexities and conflicts that actual relationships would entail. The reality distortions that surround him create a buffer zone where his will can operate without contradiction or resistance, providing him with an environment where his vision of perfect order and harmony can be implemented without the interference of independent consciousness or alternative perspectives. The consciousness constructs that implement his policies throughout the galaxy serve as extensions of this protected reality, translating his delusions into actions that affect the material world, while maintaining the illusion that his approach to governance continues to be effective and beneficial. The most tragic aspect of his madness is its effectiveness in achieving the goals he had originally pursued, as the artificial harmony he creates within his protected reality does eliminate conflict, suffering, and uncertainty for the beings who exist within his sphere of influence. The peace and prosperity that his phantom advisors praise him for achieving are genuine accomplishments, but they are purchased through the elimination of authentic consciousness and genuine choice. The final stage of his psychological breakdown involves the gradual expansion of his protected reality to encompass ever larger portions of the galaxy, as he attempts to transform the entire universe into a space where his delusions can operate without contradiction. The boundary between his throne room and external reality begins to dissolve as he extends his reality distortions outward, creating zones where his phantom advisors can appear to interact with real beings, and where his artificial family members can seem to participate in actual events. The rebellion's final communications from this period speak of a galaxy where the distinction between real and imaginary has become meaningless, where the Emperor's madness has begun to rewrite the fundamental nature of existence itself. The universe that emerges from his psychological breakdown represents not the transcendent consciousness he had once pursued, but something far more limited and dangerous, reality itself transformed into an extension of a single fractured mind. The assault on the Imperial Palace begins not with armies or starships, but with the concentrated will of every remaining consciousness in the galaxy that still maintains the capacity for independent thought. Luke and Leia Skywalker lead this final offensive against their father's reality-warping madness, supported by the scattered remnants of the rebellion and the few Imperial citizens who have managed to retain their psychological autonomy despite years of consciousness manipulation. The approach to Coruscant requires passage through regions of space where the normal laws of physics have been suspended by Anakin's unchecked power, zones where time flows in circles and matter reshapes itself according to the emotional needs of the beings who observe it. The rebel fleet, such as it exists, consists not of conventional starships but of consciousness-shielded vessels designed to maintain their structural integrity while passing through areas where reality itself has become fluid and unreliable. Padme leads the advance force in a ship that had once served as her personal transport during her senatorial career, its hull now reinforced with force-dampening materials and consciousness isolation systems that protect its crew from the mental influence that radiates outward from the galactic core. Her presence at the head of the assault represents both the personal nature of the conflict and the universal stakes involved in its resolution. The space around Coruscant has been transformed into something that defies conventional description, a three-dimensional maze of temporal distortions and probability fluctuations, where the Emperor's consciousness has begun to rewrite the fundamental structure of local reality. Navigation through this chaos requires not technological instruments, but force-assisted perception capable of detecting the narrow paths where causality still operates according to recognizable principles. The twins coordinate their approach using consciousness techniques learned from their mother's rebellion network, methods that allow them to share awareness and intentions while maintaining the individual perspectives that make their partnership more than the sum of its parts. Their combined abilities prove essential for penetrating the defensive layers that surround their father's stronghold, barriers that respond to single-minded assault but can be bypassed by consciousness that operates from multiple simultaneous viewpoints. The first line of defense they encounter consists of the consciousness constructs that have been implementing Anakin's will throughout the galaxy, entities that exist as pure information given temporary physical form. These artificial beings attempt to turn the rebels back not through violence but through persuasion that operates directly on the neural level, presenting arguments for surrender that feel emotionally compelling even when they are intellectually recognized as manipulation. Luke's response to these entities reveals the extent to which his abilities have developed beyond traditional Force user capabilities, as he demonstrates the capacity to engage them in forms of consciousness combat that operate according to principles unknown to either Jedi or Sith traditions. Rather than opposing the construct's persuasion through resistance, he embraces their arguments while simultaneously maintaining awareness of their artificial nature, creating paradoxes that cause them to collapse into incoherence. Leia's approach proves complementary, as she employs analytical techniques to deconstruct the logical frameworks that give the constructs their apparent authority and credibility. Her ability to perceive the underlying assumptions and hidden contradictions in their arguments allows her to expose the flaws in their reasoning that cause them to lose cohesion and dissolve back into the raw information from which they were formed. The second defensive layer consists of the reality distortions themselves, regions where the Emperor's emotional state has begun to override physical laws and logical consistency. Passage through these zones requires not technological protection but psychological preparation that allows the rebels to maintain their sense of identity and purpose despite exposure to environments where such concepts have no meaning. The rebel force finds itself moving through spaces where past and future exist simultaneously, where every decision they might make has already occurred and is yet to happen, where the distinction between intention and action becomes meaningless. The experience proves overwhelming for beings who lack sufficient force sensitivity or psychological training, as their consciousness struggles to process perceptual input that violates every assumption about the nature of existence. The breakthrough comes when Padme realizes that the reality distortions follow patterns that reflect her husband's psychological state rather than random chaos. That navigation through them is possible for anyone who understands the emotional logic that governs their operation. Her intimate knowledge of Anakin's thought processes and emotional patterns allows her to guide the rebel force through the maze by predicting which distortions will manifest based on the psychological needs they serve. The final approach to the palace itself requires passage through zones where Anakin's consciousness has begun to blur the boundary between his internal reality and external existence, spaces where his phantom advisors and artificial family members appear to interact with actual beings and influence real events. The rebels find themselves sharing space with the ghosts of conversations that exist only in the Emperor's mind, while somehow affecting the material world around them. The most challenging aspect of this phase involves distinguishing between authentic allies and phantom constructs that represent Anakin's idealized memories of relationships that no longer exist. The rebel force includes beings who had once served the Empire loyally but had retained enough independence to recognize the catastrophe that unlimited power had created, individuals whose motivations and loyalties must be verified through methods that can penetrate consciousness manipulation. The assault on the palace proper begins when the rebels realize that conventional approaches to the building are impossible, as its architecture has been transformed into something that exists partially outside normal space-time. The structure appears simultaneously as the governmental complex it had once been, and as a crystallized manifestation of Anakin's consciousness, with rooms and corridors that reflect his memories and desires rather than any functional design requirements. Luke and Leia coordinate their entry through different aspects of their father's psychology, with Luke approaching through pathways that reflect his emotional connections, and Leia moving through regions that correspond to his intellectual and strategic considerations. Their separate routes allow them to experience different facets of Anakin's transformation, while maintaining communication through their Force bond. The interior of the palace reveals the full extent of the Emperor's psychological breakdown, as every room contains manifestations of his conversations with phantom advisors and his interactions with artificial family members. The rebels find themselves moving through spaces where multiple time periods exist simultaneously, where past events continue to occur alongside current reality, where Anakin's memories have gained independent existence and begun to influence actual events. The throne room itself exists at the center of this chaos, a space that serves as the focal point for all the reality distortions that have consumed the galactic core. The approach to this final chamber requires the rebels to pass through representations of every significant relationship and experience in Anakin's life, encountering phantom versions of themselves that represent his idealized memories of their interactions. The confrontation with these phantom representations proves particularly challenging for Padme, Luke, and Leia, as they must resist the temptation to accept the artificial versions of themselves that express only love, admiration, and gratitude for everything Anakin has done. The phantom Padme who appears before them speaks words of devotion and appreciation that the real woman wishes she could feel, while the artificial twins display the perfect obedience and enthusiasm that had been their father's vision of their development. The final approach to Anakin himself requires all three family members to work together, combining their different perspectives and abilities to penetrate the layers of delusion and reality distortion that protect him from confronting the truth of what he has become. Padme provides emotional insight that allows them to understand the psychological needs that drive his madness, while Luke contributes empathic connection that maintains their ability to love him despite his transformation, and Leia offers analytical clarity that prevents them from being drawn into his delusional framework. The Emperor who awaits them on his impossible throne represents the culmination of unlimited power combined with unlimited emotional need, a being whose love for his family has transformed into something so overwhelming that it threatens to consume not only them but the entire universe. His appearance shifts constantly between the young man they remember and something cosmic and alien that bears only superficial resemblance to human consciousness. The battle that follows operates not in the physical realm but entirely within the sphere of consciousness and will, as each side attempts to impose their vision of reality upon the others. Anakin's approach involves overwhelming his family with the intensity of his love and the scope of his vision, trying to force them to accept the perfection he has created for them by making them experience directly the cosmic consciousness he has achieved. Luke and Leia's response demonstrates the synthesis of individual autonomy and collective coordination that represents their alternative to their father's approach, as they work together while maintaining distinct perspectives and independent judgment. Their combined consciousness proves capable of resisting Anakin's overwhelming presence while offering him something he had never experienced: genuine partnership that preserves rather than eliminates diversity. Padme's role in the confrontation involves helping Anakin understand that love which seeks to eliminate all possibility of loss necessarily destroys everything that makes the beloved worth loving. That protection which removes all capacity for choice renders meaningless the very consciousness it seeks to preserve. Her words carry the weight of years spent loving a man whose power had made authentic relationship impossible. The climax of their battle comes when Anakin is forced to choose between maintaining his cosmic consciousness and accepting the autonomy of those he loves, between preserving the perfect reality he has created and allowing the uncertainty and potential suffering that genuine relationship entails. The decision he makes will determine not only the fate of his family, but the fundamental nature of consciousness and existence throughout the galaxy. The resolution of their conflict requires not victory or defeat but transformation, as all parties involved must evolve beyond their previous understanding of power, love, and the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. The outcome that emerges from their confrontation will reshape not only the Empire, but the basic assumptions about what it means to be conscious and alive in a universe where unlimited power has made traditional categories of identity and relationship obsolete. The force of their combined will, focused through the intensity of family bonds that transcend political ideology and philosophical difference, creates a synthesis that had been impossible for any of them to achieve individually. The consciousness that emerges from their union incorporates elements of Anakin's cosmic awareness, Padmé's commitment to authentic choice, Luke's empathic connection, and Leia's analytical precision, while transcending the limitations that had constrained each of their separate approaches. The transformation that results from this synthesis begins to propagate outward from the throne room, spreading through the reality distortions that surround the palace, and gradually extending to encompass the entire galactic core. The universe that emerges from their combined consciousness represents neither the unlimited control that Anakin had pursued, nor the absolute autonomy that the rebellion had sought, but something entirely new that preserves the benefits of coordination while maintaining the possibility of genuine choice and authentic relationship. The moment of Anakin Skywalker's final choice arrives not with cosmic fanfare or dramatic revelation, but with the quiet recognition of a truth that he has spent decades avoiding. As he sits upon his impossible throne, surrounded by the artificial perfection he has created and confronted by the authentic love of his family, the Emperor who had sought to remake the universe in his image finally understands the price that unlimited power demands from those who wield it. The realization comes through his connection to Luke's empathic abilities, as his son's force-enhanced compassion allows him to experience directly the isolation and spiritual emptiness that cosmic consciousness has created within his father's awareness. For the first time since his transformation began, Anakin feels the universe from the perspective of a being whose thoughts and emotions remain genuinely his own, unfiltered by the reality distortions that have insulated him from authentic contact with others. The contrast is devastating. The cosmic awareness that had seemed like the ultimate expression of consciousness reveals itself as a form of sensory deprivation that has cut him off from the very experiences that make existence meaningful. The perfect order he has imposed upon the galaxy appears suddenly as a vast mechanism for eliminating everything spontaneous, unpredictable, and genuinely alive from the universe he sought to protect. Through Leia's analytical clarity, he perceives the logical contradictions that underlie his entire approach to love and governance. The way his desire to eliminate suffering has created forms of spiritual death that are far worse than any physical pain he had sought to prevent. Her systematic deconstruction of his philosophical foundations forces him to confront questions about the nature of meaningful existence that his power had allowed him to avoid addressing. But it is Padmé's presence that delivers the final blow to his delusions, as her continued love for him despite everything he has become provides a standard of authentic relationship against which his artificial constructs and phantom advisors reveal their essential emptiness. The woman who stands before him now represents not the idealized wife who exists only to validate his choices, but a genuine consciousness whose independent thoughts and feelings make her approval meaningful precisely because it cannot be coerced or manufactured. The choice that confronts him requires not merely the abandonment of power, but the acceptance of vulnerability and uncertainty that authentic relationship demands. To love his family genuinely rather than possessively, he must renounce the control that had seemed necessary to protect them. To preserve what makes them worth loving, he must accept the possibility that they might choose paths that lead to suffering or loss. The internal struggle that follows this recognition manifests as visible fluctuations in the reality distortions that surround the throne room, as competing aspects of his consciousness battle for dominance over his final decision. The cosmic awareness that has become his identity resists dissolution with a desperation that threatens to tear apart the fabric of local space-time, while the human heart that still exists within his transformed consciousness yearns for the connection and acceptance that only authentic love can provide. Luke and Leia experience this struggle directly through their force bonds with their father, feeling the magnitude of what he must sacrifice to choose genuine relationship over cosmic control. The consciousness that he has developed over years of unlimited power fights against its own dissolution with a will that encompasses star systems and spans galactic distances, making his potential surrender an act of cosmic significance rather than merely personal transformation. The moment of decision arrives when Anakin finally acknowledges that the beings he loves most have become strangers to him, not because of their rebellion, but because his power has eliminated his capacity to know them as they actually are rather than as he wishes them to be. The artificial versions of his family that populate his throne room dissolve as he chooses to see Padmé, Luke, and Leia as they genuinely exist rather than as extensions of his own consciousness and will. The pain of this recognition proves almost overwhelming, as he experiences for the first time in years the full emotional impact of choices and changes that his reality-warping abilities had previously allowed him to deny or reverse. The awareness that his wife and children have suffered because of decisions he made in their name, that his protection has often felt like imprisonment, that his love has sometimes manifested as a form of spiritual violence, strikes him with a force that threatens to shatter his remaining sanity. But rather than retreating again into the protective delusions that cosmic consciousness provides, Anakin chooses to accept this pain as the price of authentic relationship. His decision to embrace vulnerability rather than invulnerability, uncertainty rather than control, genuine connection rather than artificial perfection marks the beginning of his transformation back toward humanity. The process of releasing cosmic consciousness proves far more difficult than its acquisition had been, requiring not merely the abandonment of power, but the systematic dismantling of reality distortions that have become integral to his psychological functioning. Each layer of artificial control that he surrenders threatens to leave him completely exposed to suffering that he has spent years learning to avoid or eliminate. The support of his family becomes essential during this withdrawal, as Luke's empathic abilities help him process the emotional content of experiences he had previously suppressed or transformed, while Leia's analytical skills provide frameworks for understanding his situation without the cosmic perspective that had distorted his judgment. Padmé's presence offers the anchor of authentic relationship that makes the pain of vulnerability worthwhile. The dissolution of the Imperial Consciousness Network begins with Anakin's deliberate disconnection from the systems that had extended his awareness across galactic distances, a process that feels like voluntary blindness and deafness after years of cosmic perception. The sudden limitation of his consciousness to the boundaries of his physical form creates a sense of claustrophobic isolation that tests his commitment to choosing authenticity over omniscience. The reality distortions that had protected him from unwelcome truths begin to dissipate as he stops feeding them the psychic energy required for their maintenance, allowing objective reality to reassert itself throughout the regions that had been transformed by his unchecked power. The process resembles the healing of a vast wound in the fabric of existence itself, as natural laws resume their normal operation and causality returns to areas where it had been suspended by his will. The consciousness constructs that had been implementing his policies throughout the galaxy lose their animating force as he withdraws the mental energy that had given them existence, causing them to dissolve back into the information patterns from which they had been formed. Their disappearance leaves a power vacuum throughout Imperial space that threatens chaos and collapse, but also creates opportunities for authentic self-governance to emerge. The force storms that had raged throughout his reign begin to subside as his emotional state stabilizes and his consciousness returns to merely human scales of operation. The aurora displays that had danced through hyperspace fade back to their natural patterns, while the gravitational disturbances and temporal anomalies that had characterized his rule gradually disappear. The most difficult aspect of his transformation involves acknowledging the harm that his benevolent intentions had caused, accepting responsibility for suffering that had resulted from policies designed to eliminate pain and injustice, the recognition that his protection had often prevented growth, that his guidance had sometimes stunted development, that his love had occasionally damaged those it sought to serve, requires a form of moral courage that transcends anything demanded by cosmic rulership. The beings throughout the galaxy who had lived under Imperial consciousness networks experience his withdrawal as a form of liberation that is simultaneously welcome and terrifying. Populations that had grown dependent on external guidance find themselves suddenly required to make independent decisions about everything from personal relationships to planetary governance, a responsibility that many are unprepared to handle after years of benevolent control. The medical facilities that had treated consciousness network dependency become centers for helping beings readjust to independent existence, but the process proves slow and difficult for those who had lost the capacity for autonomous thought and feeling. The psychological rehabilitation required exceeds anything that conventional therapy can provide, requiring new approaches that help beings rediscover their individual identity and personal agency. Children who had grown up within the enhanced network face particular challenges, as they must learn to function without the constant connection to others that had defined their existence since birth. Educational programs designed to help them develop independent judgment and personal responsibility represent unprecedented experiments in consciousness training that will shape the next generation's understanding of what it means to be an individual. The rebellion's role shifts from resistance to reconstruction as former opponents work together to build governmental and social institutions that can function without the coordination that Imperial consciousness had provided. The challenge involves creating systems that preserve the benefits of cooperation while allowing for the diversity and disagreement that authentic democracy requires. Mon Mothma's expertise in constitutional law proves essential for designing frameworks that protect individual rights while enabling collective action. But the process requires careful balance between efficiency and autonomy that previous galactic civilizations had never successfully achieved. The democratic institutions that emerge from this effort represent evolution beyond both republic and imperial models of governance. Dr. Kresh's research into consciousness independence becomes the foundation for educational curricula that teach beings how to think and feel authentically while remaining capable of cooperation and coordination with others. Her work establishes principles for psychological development that preserve individual identity while fostering the empathy and understanding necessary for peaceful coexistence. The transformation of galactic civilization proceeds gradually over months and years as populations adjust to freedom that feels simultaneously liberating and burdensome. The peace and prosperity that imperial rule had provided persist in many regions, but they now rest on foundations of genuine choice, rather than benevolent control, making them more fragile but also more meaningful. Anakin's personal recovery follows a similar trajectory, as he slowly learns to relate to his family as independent beings, rather than extensions of his consciousness and will. The process requires him to develop forms of love that accept uncertainty and respect autonomy, emotional skills that cosmic consciousness had made unnecessary, but that authentic relationship demands. His relationship with Padme requires complete rebuilding on foundations of equality and mutual respect, rather than the protective dominance that had characterized their marriage under imperial rule. The woman he learns to love again is not the idealized figure his power had allowed him to maintain, but a genuine individual whose thoughts and feelings sometimes conflict with his own preferences and expectations. His connections with Luke and Leia evolve from the teacher-student dynamic that had defined their childhood into partnerships between equals who share goals but maintain distinct perspectives and independent judgment. The twins' development beyond their father's expectations becomes a source of pride rather than threat, as he learns to value their autonomy as evidence of successful rather than failed parenting. The final measure of his transformation comes when Anakin voluntarily submits to judgment by the beings who had suffered under his rule, accepting accountability for decisions made with benevolent intentions but harmful consequences. The trials that follow represent not revenge, but an attempt to establish principles of responsibility that will guide future exercises of power. The universe that emerges from the collapse of the Skywalker Empire represents neither the democratic idealism of the Old Republic, nor the benevolent authoritarianism of imperial rule, but something entirely new that synthesizes the benefits of both, while avoiding their characteristic failures. The galactic civilization that takes shape in the aftermath of cosmic consciousness offers hope that beings can work together effectively while preserving the independence and authenticity that make cooperation meaningful rather than merely efficient. In the quiet years that follow the dissolution of the Skywalker Empire, the galaxy slowly learns to breathe again. The aurora that once danced through hyperspace in response to an emperor's emotions now follows only the natural rhythms of cosmic forces, while the stars themselves seem to sing more softly in the absence of consciousness that had stretched across their distances, like an overwhelming symphony of control and protection. Kira Valeth closes the final archive as dawn breaks over what was once Imperial City, now simply Coruscant again, a world learning to exist without serving as the focal point for galactic consciousness. The historian who had dedicated her life to understanding the rise and fall of unlimited power finds herself at peace with questions that may never have complete answers, content to have witnessed the end of a story that had threatened to consume the very meaning of existence itself. The records she has studied speak of transformations that continue to ripple outward through space and time, as beings throughout the galaxy discover what it means to live authentically after generations of benevolent guidance. The process is neither swift nor simple, but it carries within it the promise of genuine growth and meaningful choice that had been absent from even the most prosperous years of imperial rule. On distant worlds that had once trembled under the weight of cosmic attention, children play games that their parents could never have imagined during the years when every thought and emotion was subject to invisible influence. Their laughter echoes through streets where spontaneity and unpredictability have returned like spring flowers emerging from long frozen ground, bringing color and fragrance to lives that had known only the sterile perfection of imposed harmony. The former emperor himself has found a different kind of peace in a simple dwelling on Naboo, where the meadows rolling toward distant hills provide a horizon bounded by mortal vision rather than cosmic awareness. Anakin Skywalker tends a garden where plants grow according to their own nature rather than his will, learning patience from seeds that sprout when they choose rather than when he wishes them to flourish. The man who once commanded the loyalty of 1 trillion souls now finds profound satisfaction in the friendship of neighbors who relate to him as simply another being, sharing the common experiences of mortality and limitation. Their acceptance of his presence in their community represents forgiveness on a scale that transcends political reconciliation, offering him the possibility of belonging that unlimited power had made impossible. Padme walks beside him through the quiet evenings, her hand in his carrying the weight of love that has been tested by circumstances beyond anything that previous generations had imagined. Their conversations range across subjects both mundane and profound, but they share the particular sweetness that comes from choosing to remain together after having the freedom to part, from love that continues because it wants to rather than because it must. Luke and Leia visit when their work permits, for they have chosen to dedicate their exceptional abilities to helping other beings learn the balance between individual autonomy and collective responsibility that their family's story has made possible. Their presence brings joy that feels miraculous precisely because it cannot be commanded or controlled, because their choice to spend time with their parents reflects affection rather than obligation. The twins work together throughout the galaxy, teaching meditation techniques that preserve individual identity while fostering empathy and understanding between different species and cultures. Their approach to Force education emphasizes service rather than power, helping students develop abilities that strengthen communities without overwhelming the independence of those they serve. Their students come from every world and walk of life, beings who seek not cosmic consciousness but simply the skills needed to live peacefully with others while remaining true to themselves. The academies they establish operate according to principles that honor both unity and diversity, creating spaces where different perspectives can coexist without needing to be resolved into artificial harmony. The governmental institutions that have emerged in the aftermath of the Empire reflect hard-won wisdom about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. The new Galactic Confederation operates through voluntary association rather than imposed unity, allowing member systems to maintain their own approaches to local governance while coordinating responses to challenges that transcend planetary boundaries. Mon Mothma serves as one of the Confederation's first coordinators, her experience with both democratic idealism and authoritarian efficiency providing crucial insight into the design of institutions that avoid the failures of previous galactic governments. Her work focuses on creating frameworks that preserve space for disagreement and debate while enabling the cooperation necessary for addressing shared problems. The economic systems that have replaced imperial central planning operate according to principles that balance efficiency with equity, allowing for innovation and competition while ensuring that basic needs are met for all sentient beings. The prosperity that emerges from these arrangements proves more sustainable than what imperial control had provided, rooted in genuine productivity rather than consciousness manipulation. Trade routes that had once carried goods according to imperial priorities now respond to authentic supply and demand, creating patterns of exchange that reflect the actual needs and desires of the beings they serve. The commerce that flows along these pathways brings not only material goods but cultural exchange that enriches civilizations without homogenizing them. The arts experience a renaissance as creators throughout the galaxy explore themes and perspectives that had been impossible under even the most benevolent forms of consciousness control. Painting, sculptures, music, and literature emerge that celebrate the full spectrum of sentient experience, including uncertainty, conflict, and loss, as well as joy, harmony, and discovery. These artistic works often grapple with the legacy of the imperial years, seeking to understand and integrate the experiences of beings who had lived under conditions that eliminated many forms of suffering, while also restricting many forms of growth. The cultural conversation that emerges from these explorations helps galactic civilization process its collective trauma, while learning from its near escape from cosmic totalitarianism. Educational institutions develop curricula that teach critical thinking and emotional intelligence as fundamental skills for maintaining both individual autonomy and social cooperation. Students learn to question authority while respecting expertise, to empathize with others while maintaining personal boundaries, to work together while preserving their unique perspectives and contributions. The medical facilities that had once treated consciousness network dependency evolve into centers for helping beings develop psychological resilience and authentic relationships. The therapeutic techniques pioneered during the post-imperial transition become foundational elements of mental health care that prevents future generations from becoming vulnerable to the same forms of benevolent manipulation. Research into consciousness and force phenomena continues under careful ethical oversight, guided by principles that prioritize the preservation of individual autonomy over the pursuit of enhanced capabilities. The scientific community that emerges from this work develops knowledge that serves rather than dominates, empowering beings to make informed choices about their own development. The exploration of the unknown regions proceeds more cautiously than during the imperial expansion, with expedition teams trained to respect the sovereignty and diversity of alien civilizations rather than seeking to integrate them into galactic networks. The contacts that result from these missions enrich understanding of consciousness and existence while preserving the independence of all parties involved. The Force itself seems to flow more gently through the galaxy in the years following Anakin's transformation, no longer channeled through cosmic-scale manipulations but expressing itself through countless small acts of compassion, creativity, and connection. The balance that emerges is not the artificial equilibrium that had been imposed through unlimited power, but the dynamic harmony that arises when diverse forces interact freely. Children who grow up in this transformed galaxy develop capacities for both independence and cooperation that exceed anything achieved by previous generations, learning from early age how to maintain their individual identity while contributing meaningfully to collective endeavors. Their development suggests possibilities for conscious evolution that transcend both the limitations of isolation and the dangers of merger. The story that began with a young slave's dreams of freedom ends with a galaxy that has learned to honor both the individual consciousness that makes choice meaningful and the connections between beings that make existence worthwhile. The legacy of the Skywalker family becomes not the cautionary tale of power corrupted, but the inspirational example of love that chooses growth over control, authenticity over perfection, hope over certainty. As night falls over Naboo and the stars emerge in patterns that follow only their own ancient rhythms, Anakin Skywalker sleeps the peaceful sleep of one who has found his way home from the farthest reaches of power to the simple miracle of being human. His dreams are his own again, filled with the quiet joys and gentle sorrows that make existence precious, precisely because it cannot last forever. The galaxy dreams with him, but separately, each consciousness following its own path through the vast mystery of being alive in a universe where meaning must be created rather than imposed, where love must be chosen rather than commanded, where peace comes not from the elimination of all conflict but from the wisdom to transform struggle into growth, difference into harmony, and individual voices into a symphony that no single conductor could ever fully comprehend or control. Thank you for joining this journey through the hidden chronicles of what might have been. If these tales from the galaxy far, far away have brought you peace in the twilight hours, remember to explore the endless mysteries that await among the stars, where every choice creates new possibilities, and every story holds the seeds of countless others yet to be told. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May the Force be with you always.